Testing, yo, what up? Friday cope. Today I'm listening to some narration from a channel called Horses. Yeah, it's about that story of the guy who went to Alaska and Chris McCandless in '92. Yeah, I saw the movie when it came out, Into the Wild, back then, 15 years ago. Yeah, I was thinking to myself, what a crazy idea. I mean, going somewhere where there is freezing danger. That's exactly what caught up to him. Yeah, let's get straight right into it. I have this fatigue. Yeah. Can't even fucking talk properly.
In 1992, 4 hunters discovered a decomposing human body in the Alaskan wilderness. This body was Chris McCandless, a 24-year-old who had abandoned all of his possessions and hiked into the Yukon with little more than a rifle and some books. McCandless was an intelligent, hard-working young man who came from an affluent family and graduated college with high marks. All of the opportunities of the world were surely within reach, and yet his life ended, alone, starving to death, in the Alaskan countryside. The story of McCandless became an article, a best-selling novel, and eventually a movie. The tale ignited a firestorm of critique, comment, and speculation, much of which still rages on today. Who was Chris McCandless? Why did he march headstrong into the wilderness? What fate came upon him? Thankfully, these answers are relatively easy to find. They have been hidden behind public opinion and a dark family secret, but the truth about Chris is within reach. On his journey, all the way up to his last day on Earth, the young man recorded everything in a personal journal. In 1993, author John Krakauer published a short editorial in Outside magazine about Chris McCandless called Death of an Innocent. It received such widespread attention and acclaim that Krakauer soon expanded it into a book called Into the Wild. That novel then spawned a movie, some TV documentaries, and another book. This second book was written by Chris's sister and describes the tumultuous home life which propelled Chris to his Alaskan voyage. By pulling from all of these sources, we can earn a holistic, earnest understanding of Chris McCandless. Chris was born into an upper-class family in Inglewood, California, but eventually attended Emory University in Atlanta. Immediately upon graduating, Chris mailed his parents his final grades, which were spectacular. Indeed, he'd always been a brilliant, intelligent, and hard-working student. McCandless had all of the advantages a person could be born with, and a work ethic to make good upon these promises. At first glance, all signs may have been pointing towards a successful, fruitful life. But Chris's graduation came and went, and by August, his parents had not heard a word from their son. Worried about his safety and whereabouts, the parents traveled to Atlanta. When they arrived at Chris's apartment, they found a for rent sign on the window. In fact, Chris had actually vanished from the apartment 5 weeks earlier. He had instructed the post office to hold his mail, rather than forward it anywhere, so that his parents would have no idea as to his destination. So it was early July when, full of the rebellion of youth and unshackled by the demands of academia, Chris McCandless donated all of his remaining college fund to the charity Oxfam. He informally changed his name to the moniker AlexanderSupertramp. With this new identity, Chris drove his yellow Datsun west from Atlanta and eventually arrived thousands of miles away at Lake Mead National Recreation Area in Arizona. Chris steered the car off-road and drove 2 miles to the lake's southern shore. There he pitched his tent and thus began the odyssey that would become both his life and his death. Admittedly, the earliest days of Chris's adventure were marked by folly and misfortune. 2 days after he arrived, seasonal rainstorms hit Lake Mead. The rainwater pushed down from the higher parts of the park, quickly flooding Chris's campsite. The rain did not destroy his car, but it had soaked the engine. After the flood, when Chris tried to start his Datsun, the engine would not turn over. His repeated attempts to start the vehicle drained the battery entirely. If Chris walked to the paved road and asked for help with his car, that would inevitably bring a number of problems. Any towing company would need to speak to the park rangers. The authorities would have questions and likely fines for Chris, many of which would probably culminate in contacting his parents. Furthermore, his car was uninsured, his registration had lapsed, and his license was expired. So Chris decided to just leave the Datsun behind. It was another material possession which he could now reject. He removed its plates, buried them, and left his car under a tarp. He took the small amount of paper currency he had and burned it. Still, Chris was enamored by the American West. Without a car, he hitchhiked around the region for 2 months. He met vagabonds and escaped arrests, but primarily reveled in the natural abundance of the area. He made his way to Lake Tahoe, hiked into the Sierra Nevada, and walked along the famous Pacific Crest Trail. Towards the end of July, Chris found himself in Northern California. There, he lived and worked with 6 other travelers for a man named Ernie. As it turned out, Ernie had no intention of paying Chris or the other workers, so McCandless hit the road once again. At the end of October, Chris caught a ride with a trucker who took him all the way to the Colorado River in Arizona. But now, Chris had his sights on a new destination, the Gulf of California in Mexico. Without identification, Chris realized that crossing the border on foot or via hitchhiking would be virtually impossible. So McCandless made his most daring decision yet. With the little money he'd earned from odd jobs here and there, Chris bought a second-hand canoe. He would paddle 400 miles down the Colorado River to cross the border and land in Mexico. For such an audacious plan, it went surprisingly well. Chris drifted on the river through the desert, occasionally stopping to send postcards to people he'd met on his journeys or to resupply with food and water. When his canoe reached the Morelos Dam on the Mexican border, he snuck into the country by paddling through the dam's floodgates. The plan worked, and he recorded in his journal. Alex looks quickly around for signs of trouble, but his entry of Mexico is either unnoticed or ignored. Alexander is jubilant. But after the dam, Chris found the river turning into a labyrinthian system of canals, channels, and unmaintained waterways. After attempting with only moderate success to navigate this maze, Chris encountered some Mexican officials. They provided directions to the Gulf of California, but perhaps owing to a language barrier, the directions were quite poor, and Chris soon found himself lost once again. Chris carried his canoe across land for 3 days before meeting some duck hunters. They told him he was once again headed in the wrong direction, but offered to drive him and the canoe in their pickup truck to the coast. In Chris's journal, he recognized this as a, quote, miracle. Sure enough, the hunters dropped Chris at a fishing village on the Gulf of California. There, Chris slowed down his adventure for a while. He canoed in the sea and took photos of wildlife, sunsets, and dunes. During this time, Chris all but abandoned his journal, producing just 100 words over the course of his month on the Gulf. By the end of his time there, Chris had not spoken to or seen another person for 36 days. He survived on a 5-pound bag of rice and marine life foraged from the sea. But as was the trend for McCandless, he once again grew restless. On January 18th, Chris attempted to pass back into the United States without identification, and he was apprehended by immigration authorities. He spent a night in jail, and the police confiscated his .38 caliber Colt Python handgun, but Chris was released the next day. For 6 weeks, Chris roamed across the Southwest. He wandered and hitchhiked from Houston to the Pacific coast. Though Chris's spirits were high, he'd lost 25 pounds and was suffering from malnutrition. Chris's journeys were taking their toll, so he settled down to rest and recuperate in his next semi-permanent residence, Las Vegas. There he got a job at an Italian restaurant, and he entirely stopped his journal entries. We don't know much about the specific circumstances, but McCandless left Las Vegas in May 1991 and arrived at Bullhead City, Arizona in October. Bullhead became perhaps the most permanent home Chris occupied since leaving college. He had a full-time job at McDonald's. He opened a savings account, and he commuted to work on a bicycle. Chris applied to the job with his real name and social security number. He began squatting in an abandoned trailer near the city. The trailer, though empty, was furnished, had electric sockets, and made for a reasonable home for Chris. In the years that followed his death, his managers and co-workers generally spoke highly of Chris McCandless. They said he was a good worker, dependable, and amicable enough. However, they also noted he had an absent, almost spacey affect about him. After clocking out, Chris didn't spend time with his co-workers. Even during idle workday conversations, he simply waxed on and on about nature and his travels, specifically about his newest plan, a journey to Alaska. And indeed, when he left Bullhead, Chris had only one destination in mind. Of course, Chris didn't immediately make it to Alaska. He had very little money, and further, Chris believed that taking a plane up north would be cheating. So he made his way to a place called Slab City in Southern California. Once a Navy base, but long since abandoned, Slab City was, and still is, a grid of concrete foundations in the middle of the desert. It's a sort of makeshift town of vagabonds, anarchists, drifters, and criminals on the run. The slabs were also home to regular swap meets, where denizens and people in the surrounding areas set up booths to sell second-hand goods. McCandless got a job working in one of these booths, and did well to ingratiate himself into the community. He became quite close with his employers and their friends, though Chris was still unwavering. Most of his conversation circled endlessly around his Alaskan voyage. Chris was too substantive in these plans. Every morning he trained physically for the perils of the Alaskan wilderness. He studied survival strategies and traded ideas with the denizens of the slabs. And so he soon hitchhiked out of Slab City. Chris's next stop was Carthage, South Dakota. There, McCandless worked as a farmhand. He wasn't particularly skilled on the farm, but Chris was willing to throw himself at grunt work. He was tenacious and was perfectly happy to handle projects that no one else really wanted to do. McCandless spent his days cleaning warehouses, exterminating pests, painting buildings, and pulling weeds. Still, he spent his free time on his Alaskan plans. He continued to study survival. He sought advice from hunters and survivalists in Carthage. Chris had resolved to hunt for his food in Alaska, so he learned everything he could in Carthage about stalking game, butchering animals, and curing meat for preservation. On April 15th, his friends and co-workers on the farm gathered to see Chris on his way. McCandless had a heavy backpack, $1,000 in his boot, and not much else. Chris's plan was to return to Carthage and work at that same farm after he was finished in Alaska. He left his journal and photo album with the farm's owners for safekeeping. But when the farmers hugged him goodbye, something seemed amiss. According to one account, "I noticed he was crying. That frightened me. He wasn't planning on being gone all that long. I figured he wouldn't have been crying unless he intended to take some big risks and knew he might not be coming back." That's when I started having a bad feeling that we wouldn't ever see Chris again. National parks like those in Alaska are constantly coming under threat. Recently, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum directed America's national parks to remain open despite massive budget cuts and layoffs. One way to keep up with our national park system is Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that helps you develop better news habits and get a more honest, well-rounded view of the world. They gather articles from over 50,000 sources so you can compare how different news outlets are reporting the same story. Funds a country at ground. The man who reporting is tells you that the nation where you can get for the journey. Just 3 days after departing South Dakota, Chris landed at Laird River Hot Springs, the border of the Yukon Territory. Chris did not believe himself quite prepared for the journey into the wilderness, so he hitched a ride once again, this time to the city of Fairbanks. In Fairbanks, Chris spent much of his time in the library. Specifically, he read through a book called Tanana Plant Lore, an ethnobotany of the Dena'ina Indians of south central Alaska. This is an extensive, dense, scholarly piece which catalogs and explains the Yukon's edible plant species. McCandless purchased a used, semi-automatic 22 caliber rifle with a scope which he planned on using to hunt game. Along with the rifle, Chris secured 400 rounds of hollow point ammunition. Feeling well prepared, Chris set out. He carried a parka, the rifle, a 10-pound bag of rice, 2 sandwiches, some corn chips, and a sizable collection of books. McCandless arrived at the Stampede Trail, a remote, unkept road which leads into Denali National Park and winds through the Alaskan wilderness. Spring had begun to arrive along the trail. Most streams were thawed and flowing. The snowpack had largely melted, and plant life was beginning to turn green again, so Chris McCandless began his final journey. According to his journal, on April 29th, McCandless fell through some ice as he walked across frozen beaver ponds. It seems that Chris was largely unharmed, and he continued walking down the long Stampede Trail. After 20 miles of hiking, Chris happened upon an old, abandoned bus. This was quite the blessing for McCandless. The bus's former residents had left it stocked with matches, bug spray, a bed, and a stove. Chris was well aware of his good fortune. In his journal, Chris declared this Magic Bus Day. Now, the bus was not his final destination. He planned to simply keep walking west until he hit the Bering Sea. But Chris decided to make use of the bus as a temporary shelter before proceeding onward. A wave of snow from the lingering winter came upon the area. According to his journal, Chris was snowed in at the bus and categorized his situation as, quote, disaster. Chris set out to hunt for game, but he was met with repeated misfortune. He failed to shoot a bear. He missed his shot on some ducks. According to his journal, Chris was on his, quote, 4th day of famine when he finally shot and killed a squirrel. But Chris McCandless was smart, capable, and adaptable. The fresh snow continued to melt, and Chris foraged for lingonberries and rose hips. His luck and skill improved with hunting. Over the next 6 weeks, he shot and ate squirrel, grouse, duck, geese, and other small game. That said, stalking for animals and hunting game requires a lot of energy. The snow had thawed, leaving behind a deep, muddy ground which proved physically difficult to walk through. Chris realized that it was unlikely he could eat sufficient nutrients to sustain his body in a 500-mile walk to the Bering Sea. So he changed his plans. After hiking 15 miles from his shelter, he turned around and decided to make the bus his home for the rest of the summer. Perhaps to his chagrin, Chris McCandless wasn't exactly deep in the Yukon. He was 30 miles from a major highway. He was 16 miles from a large tourist attraction in Denali Park and its National Park Service workers. In any case, Alaska is a punishing, unforgiving place. One need not be at the Bering Sea to be in danger, and indeed Chris did not see another human for the rest of his life. So at the end of May, Chris made the bus his home in earnest. There were 4 cabins within a 6-mile range of Chris's location, one of which was well stocked with food and emergency supplies. Chris did not have a map, so he did not know these existed, but even if he did, they would have been of little use. In early April, they had all been vandalized and burgled, leaving the food supplies spoiled. So whether he knew it or not, settling in the bus was a perfectly good decision. Chris wrote a list of short and longer-term chores, including things like making a map, collecting firewood, building a bathtub, and collecting ice for refrigeration. Following this, Chris experienced a string of hunting success. On May 28th, a duck. On June 1st, 5 squirrels. June 3rd, a porcupine, 4 squirrels, and 3 birds. On June 5, he bagged a Canada goose. The pinnacle of his hunting came on June 9th, when he wrote in his journal in all capital letters, "Moose." It was, in fact, caribou, not a moose. Although overjoyed initially, Chris began to feel a tide of remorse after killing the caribou. It provided hundreds of pounds of meat, but Chris was just one person. McCandless believed it was morally wrong to waste meat that had been killed for food. So he spent days trying to preserve the caribou. He boiled the organs and tried to smoke most of the meat. But his efforts, according to Chris's journal, were unsuccessful. June 14th. Maggots already. Smoking appears ineffective. Don't know. Looks like disaster. I now wish I had never shot the moose. One of the greatest tragedies of my life. Ultimately, most of the meat spoiled, and Chris was forced to leave it in the forest for wolves and scavenging animals. This whole incident inspired a great sadness in Chris, and he lamented and rebuked himself for weeks on end at the animal's death. But in the days that followed, he concluded, quote, "Henceforth will learn to accept my errors, however great they be." Chris continued hunting, foraging, and surviving for another 6 weeks before deciding that his Alaskan odyssey had come to its close. He dubbed it his, quote, "final and greatest adventure," and for reasons we may never entirely know, McCandless was ready to go home. Chris patched his jeans, shaved his face, organized his things, and took a commemorative photo of his ostensible final day in the wilderness. On July 3rd, Chris left his bus, intent on rejoining civilization. After 2 days of walking, Chris arrived again at the same series of beaver ponds. When he'd seen them in April, the ponds were still frozen from the winter season and had been passable on foot. But now, in July, they had thawed. Instead of walkable sheets of ice, the ponds were now a 3-acre lake. This was seemingly no terrible problem. Chris hiked up a nearby hillside around the lake to cross a river on his new route, but the seasons once again revealed the enormity of their changes. When Chris had arrived in April, the river was more of a creek, knee-deep, cold, but easily passable on foot. Now, in July, a combination of spring rain and melted mountain glaciers had flooded the river. It was opaque with sediment, hypothermia cold, rushing dangerously fast and 100 feet wide. The river was too deep to wade. The current would have simply swept Chris away. Not far from where he was, the river became a cauldron of bubbling white water. To attempt to cross on foot was, even for the most seasoned adventurer, a simple death sentence. Chris McCandless did not know that about half a mile from where he stood at the riverbank, there was a disused geological station. When in use, the station was equipped with a cart and cable, utilized by scientists for crossing the river, and now often used by hunters for that same purpose. If Chris had known of the station, crossing the river would have been a very simple task. But he did not. So in his journal, Chris wrote, "Disaster. Rained in. River look impossible. Lonely. Scared."
Played stupid games, win
Chris
stupid
returned to
prizes.
the bus on July 8th. Although not to his plan, it was a good time to be in the Alaskan countryside. The warm months meant that plant and animal life were both thriving. Getting food wouldn't be too difficult. The weather, likewise, was less dangerous than in other times of the year. It rained and rained through July. During this time, Chris had tremendous success hunting. He killed 35 squirrels, 9 birds, and 2 frogs. He also foraged well, eating wild potatoes, rhubarb, berries, and mushrooms. While certainly not in peak physical condition, he was sustaining himself. He was rail thin and weak, but far from death. However, that suddenly changed. A look at his journal reveals a series of ominous messages. On July 30th, Chris McCandless wrote in all capital letters, "Extremely weak, fault of pot seed, much trouble just to stand up, starving, great jeopardy." There are no journal entries for July 31st or August 1st. On August 2nd, he wrote of, quote, terrible wind. On August 5th, his 100th day in the Alaskan wild, Chris's journal reads, "In weakest condition of life. Death looms as serious threat. Too weak to walk out. Have literally become trapped in the wild. No game." On August 12th, Chris desperately went foraging for berries. Before leaving, he tore a page from one of his books and scrawled on it a desperate SOS. "SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you." Chris did make it back to the bus, where he wrote his very last journal entry. Beautiful blueberries. At some point during the preceding week, Chris tore a page from the memoir of Louis L'Amour. L'Amour had quoted a poem from Robinson Jeffers called "Wise Men in Their Bad Hours." The poem read, "Death's a fierce meadowlark, but to die having made something more equal to the centuries than muscle and bone is mostly to shed weakness. The mountains are dead stone, the people admire or hate their stature, their insolent quietness. The mountains are not softened or troubled, and a few dead men's thoughts have the same temper." There are many ways to interpret this poem into Chris's life. The title perhaps hints at self-assessment. Maybe McCandless saw himself as a wise man in a bad hour. But the content of the poem is more revealing. It describes the triumph of having done or created something more significant than the simple errands of human existence. It describes, indeed, an ultimate triumph of the natural world. Chris was dying. He knew it and had remarkably come to peace with that fact. He took one final photo, which shows him brutally emaciated but smiling enthusiastically. In the picture, he held a note written on the reverse of Jeffers' poem. It read, "I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye, and may God bless all." Chris McCandless then crawled into his sleeping bag and died. Chris was in reasonably good health throughout his trip, even after returning to the bus. Not great, but survivable. However, in a matter of days, he plunged from relative well-being to a death so obvious even he knew it was incoming. After all, a person must be very ill to conclude, with no medical knowledge, that death is imminent. So what killed Chris McCandless? Chris's note pins the blame squarely and obviously on potato seeds, reading, "fault of pot seeds." While helpful, this diagnosis is decidedly imprecise, so it has produced a number of theories. One of Chris's friends in South Dakota suggested that he may have purchased some potato seeds before going to Alaska with the intention of planting a vegetable garden in the wilderness. The theory goes that he never got around to planting the garden and instead ate the seeds out of desperation. Potato seeds are in fact poisonous. When eaten, they can cause vomiting, diarrhea, and headaches. They can increase heart rate and blood pressure to dangerous levels. But to achieve this level of poisoning, Chris would have needed to eat pounds and pounds of the potato seeds. There's no reason to believe Chris carried or ate such an absurd, massive quantity of potato seeds in Alaska. It is possible, but tremendously unlikely. Furthermore, his journal mostly discusses his diet and food. Nowhere in the journal does he mention eating large amounts of potato seeds. Before embarking on the Stampede Trail, Chris intensely studied the book Tenayana Plant Lore. The book discusses a species of wild potato called Hedysarum alpinum, which grows all throughout the region. Indigenous Alaskans harvested, cooked, and consumed these wild potatoes regularly. The springtime is the ideal season for these potatoes, but they become dry and tough during the summer. According to Chris's journal and a photo he took, he ate these potatoes in July. But also in that month, as the potatoes fell out of season, he started to consume the seeds as well. It was in late July when his fault of pot seed journal entry appears. There's another species which grows in Alaska called Hedysarum mackenzie. Although these are wild peas rather than potatoes, the plants are virtually indistinguishable from one another. these wild peas are extremely toxic. Native Alaskans took great care to avoid confusing them with the wild potatoes, likely because they knew of the poison. Other naturalists have documented this phenomenon, noting that Hedicerum mackenzie had almost killed natives who mistakenly ate the plant. As a newcomer to the Alaskan wilderness, it seems likely that Chris McCandless could have misidentified the plant. So this was the theory espoused and accepted by John Krakauer in his original article for Outside Magazine. It became the widely accepted theory among journalists and the general public. But when Krakauer wrote his follow-up book, Into the Wild, he came upon a new idea. As Krakauer notes, it is a strange mistake for Chris to make. For weeks, Chris consumed the potato seeds without mistaking them for peas. Both species grow in the same area, and it is almost certain McCandless came upon each in his foraging. Furthermore, the page in Tenayana Plant Lore, which discusses the toxic peas, is literally the very next page after the one detailing the potato seeds. The book indeed makes special note of the minute differences between the potato seeds and the toxic peas. It was a book Chris studied quite intensely, so it seems unlikely that he would have somehow just entirely skipped this section. Krakauer believes it was not the wild peas, but in fact the wild potato seeds that killed Chris. At first glance, this is a strange theory. Tenayana Plant Lore does not describe the potato seeds as toxic. Furthermore, as Krakauer notes, no scientific, botanical, or medical literature has ever described these potato seeds as being poisonous. So where did Krakauer get this theory? Like many of its relatives, this species of potato seed produces strong concentrations of usually toxic chemical compounds called alkaloids. These alkaloids coat the seeds to prevent animals from eating them in the late summer. If ingested, the potato seed's alkaloids would produce a number of effects, but would not immediately kill a person. Instead, this particular toxin has the dangerous effect of preventing the body from turning food into storable, usable energy. It basically makes a person starve, no matter how much food they eat. If an animal, or a person, is already malnourished, these toxins affect the body faster and more intensely. When Krakauer had these potato seeds tested for this specific alkaloid, his theory was all but confirmed. They were indeed present. So the most likely theory is just that. Chris McCandless died from eating potato seeds during the wrong time of the year. But perhaps more truly, he died from the sheer, unrelenting, and labyrinthian power of the natural world. We might be tempted to say that if Chris had studied harder or learned more, he would have known better. But the presence of alkaloids in those seeds is so profoundly exact and niche that, as Krakauer notes, even an experienced botanist could have made the same mistake. So we have the story of Chris McCandless, but it is a story which can be interpreted many ways, which can be, and has been, used to paint a diverse range of pictures of the young vagabond. Some will derisively say he was just an arrogant young man suffering from a fatal case of affluenza. Others may be more reductive and call him simply stupid. But if there is one thing we can be certain of people, it is that they are not characters or caricatures. People are products of environments, moved by an infinitely complex hurricane of emotions, thoughts, qualities, and events. Chris McCandless was no exception.
That's it. That's the end of the video.
Given the fact that I, of course, never truly knew Chris McCandless, the best I can do in estimating his character is just that, an estimation. But much of his life is in the public record: journal entries, deeds, relationships, family history. So I think this estimation is a relatively decent one. McCandless was born into a wealthy family. His father, Walt, was a successful aerospace engineer and consultant. The McCandless family lived in an upper-middle-class suburb in Virginia, where they seemed to exist as a utopian nuclear family. But this was a carefully crafted illusion, and in fact the family was racked by nightmarish turmoil, but that is a topic we will return to shortly. Throughout his schooling days and college career, McCandless was an outstanding student. He was extremely intelligent, as many people who encountered him on his travels would later remark. But still, Chris seemed to resent his privileged upbringing. He lived a rather Spartan life at college. His room was furnished with a mattress on the floor, a few milk crates, and a single table. You see, he had a strong repulsion to material goods and luxuries, despite, or probably because of, his upbringing. After graduating college, he donated his remaining college fund to Oxfam, a charity dedicated to fighting hunger. When his parents attempted to buy Chris a new car as a graduation present, McCandless was incensed. He had a decade-old Datsun with 128,000 miles on it, which he insisted was a perfect car. He wrote in a letter to his sister, "I can't believe they'd try and buy me a car. I've told them a million times that I have the best car in the world, a car that has spanned the continent from Miami to Alaska, a car that has in all those thousands of miles not given me a single problem, a car that I will never trade in, a car that I am very strongly attached to. Yet they ignore what I say and think I'd actually accept a new car from them. I'm going to have to be real careful not to accept any gifts from them in the future because they will think they have bought my respect. Clearly, Chris loved his Datsun, but I think it's fair to say the rejection of a new car was more than the shabby temper tantrum of an affluent young man. The prospect of a new car seemed to strike Chris as emblematic of a larger, more grotesque problem with his family and the culture of material possessions. It was precisely this culture which Chris endeavored to reject. It is tempting and perhaps not entirely misguided to say Chris McCandless was ungrateful and arrogant. He was born with all of the advantages and opportunities a person could ever hope for, and simultaneously happy to cast them aside entirely. It's difficult to reckon with the idea of someone being born with all of these advantages and rejecting them. For those in life who were born into any iota of struggle, such a decision may be somewhere between ludicrous and offensive. But at least he truly rejected those things. Many people posture with this rejection while keeping a safety net around, acting one way for the sake of fashion or perception, but existing more truthfully in another. Chris did not write to his parents for money. In moments of emergency, he did not seek refuge in his family's status. He did not bank on some existential backup plan. At the very harshest, Chris's rejection of his background could be cast as unreasonable, but certainly this rejection was whole and it was truthful. McCandless was a kind young man. He was courteous, and despite leaning on the deeds of strangers as he hitchhiked, Chris repeatedly refused favors and handouts. He developed deep relationships with the people he met, often communicating for years via post after leaving them behind for his next destination. Chris could be spacey and distant, but this was displayed alongside a tendency for gregariousness. A friend of Chris's from Slab City told Krakauer he had a good time when he was around people, a real good time. At the swap meet, he'd talk and talk and talk to everybody who came by. He must have met 6 or 7 dozen people in Nyland, and he was friendly with every one of them. He needed his solitude at times, but he wasn't a hermit. He did a lot of socializing. Sometimes I think it was like he was storing up company for the times when he knew nobody would be around. Chris, too, was hard-working. The various odd jobs he took on his travels, Chris's employers generally regarded him as reliable and not afraid of getting his hands dirty. While he was not talented at each temporary vocation, he was dependable and put forth genuine effort. One of his temporary employers said of Chris, "I've given jobs to lots of hitchhikers over the years. Most of them weren't much good, didn't really want to work. It was a different story with Chris. He was the hardest worker I've ever seen. Didn't matter what it was, he'd do it. Hard physical labor, mucking rotten grain and dead rats out of the bottom of the hole. Jobs where you just get so damn dirty, you couldn't even tell what you looked like at the end of the day. He never quit in the middle of something. If he started a job, he'd finish it. It's almost like a moral thing for him. He was what you'd call extremely ethical. He set pretty high standards for himself." But beyond these very palatable qualities, Chris McCandless overflowed with intensity. He was stubborn and, like many young people, tremendously idealistic. Chris admired and took inspiration from ascetic and transcendental authors, poring over their works and emulating the qualities of self-reliance, anti-materialism, and good, hard work. With this in mind, we can know that Chris's venture into Alaska was not one taken lightly. He was intelligent and well-read and reasonably down-to-earth. As Krakauer notes, Chris did not anticipate the Yukon as being some utopian wilderness which would accommodate him with ease. Quite the opposite. He knew that it would bring pain, struggle, and hardship. This is exactly what Chris sought for. We must too consider that Chris was in fact very ambitious, but he possessed a unique sort of ambition, not chained to career and material things. It was not that Chris took his advantages for granted or failed to see their significance. More accurately, Chris's desires in life were drastically misaligned with these advantages. He had been equipped at birth prodigiously, sure, but equipped for a life he had no interest in leading. He was given tools for a job entirely separate from the one he hoped to accomplish. Generally, the professional world provides guardrails which prevent young people from doing anything too self-destructive in the aims of their ambition. The first-year banker cannot ruin a company. An early career lawyer cannot spring mass murderers from jail. The entry-level tradesman is generally not tasked with constructing a palace from scratch. But because Chris's ambitions were so far from the monorail of our society, he did not have these aforementioned safeties. Our systems do not protect the young adventurer in the way they do a young banker, lawyer, or tradesman. So Chris was able to run full steam ahead, carrying with him the ignorance and folly of youth. It would also be tempting and arguable to say that Chris was just arrogant. We could say he was clearly unprepared for this Alaskan adventure, and as a consequence of hubris, he died in the wilderness. I think this is a strange combination of correct and misguided. In my experience, youth and arrogance are part and parcel. Where there is youth, unlearned and unaffected by the realities of the world, there is too some form of arrogance. I don't think this is always bad. Arrogance can bring to pass realities that may have been otherwise extinguished by cowardice or worry. But the binary relationship of youth and arrogance is almost universally true in one shade or another. We must not hold this too severely in case against anyone, including Chris McCandless. Chris was also in many ways very successful in Alaska. He survived for 113 days, equipped with nothing but his own abilities and knowledge. It was likely only owing to an unknown, unpublished factoid that he died. Aside from this one, unfortunately fatal, mistake, Chris did survive in Alaska with relative success. I don't generally like to wade into analysis of contemporary media, but here it does prove a point very well. In the modern television program alone, qualified and often expert survivalists are sent into the wilderness. They are allowed to take with them a number of critical tools for survival, and the longest person to stay is given a massive cash prize. Of these dozens and dozens of fully qualified contestants, all of whom are experienced and equipped with a buffet of survival tools, the longest remaining entrant stayed in the wilderness for 100 days, about 2 weeks shorter than McCandless. Other contestants have won the competition after as little as 40 days. This may not be a perfect comparison, but it does illustrate the point. Chris McCandless was 22 years old. He had no incentive other than his own desires. We could be harsh and say he was ill-equipped, inexperienced, or underprepared, but still, he was more successful than many contemporary experts have been in this sort of endeavor. At this point, we have a pretty good estimation of Chris McCandless as a person, but there is still one massive piece missing from this puzzle. We are all products of our environments. Chris was no exception, and his environment reveals absolute mountains about McCandless himself and his motivations. Chris McCandless had a number of influences. As mentioned, his heroes were authors like Tolstoy and Thoreau, these affluent men who rejected luxury in favor of hardship and monkish existences. Chris McCandless was indeed born into a sort of luxury, a house of prosperity, but it was exactly this background which propelled him to reject material things, to venture into Alaska. In 2015, Chris's sister, Corinne McCandless, published the book The Wild Truth. In this work, Corinne tells a story which is notably absent from Krakauer's famous book, The Abuse-Laden Childhood of Chris McCandless. Corinne relayed this information to Krakauer when he was researching for Into the Wild, but she did not give her blessing for him to include the material. It was a story she later said that she wanted to tell on her own. I think this is a reasonable desire. Indeed, when Corinne published her book, Krakauer publicly applauded the work. In any case, this material radically and certainly changes the story of Chris McCandless. Chris and Corinne's parents were Billy and Walt McCandless. When Walt met Billy, he was already married to a woman named Marcia. Walt also had a child with Marcia. The married Walt told Billy he would be leaving his wife, but this wasn't true. In reality, Marcia had been trying to leave Walt for some time, but Walt was an alcoholic, abusive husband. The physical abuse was tremendous. At one point, he fractured a vertebrae in Marcia's back, prompting their 13-year-old son to call the police. Billy eventually became pregnant with Chris, but instead of leaving Marcia, Walt entered into a bigamous relationship. For years, he was married to both Billy and Marcia at the same time, before Marcia eventually fled the abusive home. The entirety of this did little to quell Walt's fury. Throughout Chris and Corinne's childhood, Walt beat Billy and their children relentlessly. He was a violent alcoholic who lorded over the family home with an iron fist. The parents got into yelling, violent arguments. Walt hurled insults at Billy, chased her around the home, and threw her into walls. On one occasion, he attempted to choke Billy to death. Billy screamed to the children, begging for help. In response, Walt beckoned the children into the room so they could see, quote, "What your mother is making me do." Each day after arriving home from work, Walt screamed a barrage of orders to the children and admonished Billy if she was not dressed properly. He required she wear a short skirt, high heels, and have her hair and makeup pin precise. Walt constantly berated Billy. He told her she would be nothing without him. He reminded her that he was a genius, while she didn't even have a college education. According to Corinne's book, Walt screamed things like, quote, "I put the first American spacecraft on the moon. You've never done anything important." After years of abuse, Chris and Corinne learned to hide at the sight of their father's car arriving home. If Chris or Corinne missed their chores or teased one another, the children were made to choose the weapon of discipline. They routinely combed through Walt's collection of belts, looking for the one which would hurt the least. But even this choice was a lie. If Chris or Corinne selected the wrong belt, Walt would make them pick another. Once a weapon had been selected, Walt spanked the children with the leather belt in a drunken rage. Corinne described him as having a, quote, "terrifying smile like an addict in the climax of a high." After high school graduation, Chris told his father that he wanted to travel through the summer. Chris said he was tired of the structure of life, that he had grown weary of everything being predetermined and set out for him. Chris wanted to get out and enjoy the world for a few weeks. Walt was furious. He insisted that Chris give a moment-by-moment itinerary for his plans. He told Chris that he was irresponsible and stupid, despite the son having been a straight-A student, a star athlete, and having worked 2 jobs all the while. As the shouting match concluded, Chris turned his back to leave. Walt rushed forward and punched Chris right in the center of his spine. As is often the case, this abuse happened behind a carefully constructed facade of perfection. After beating the children, Walt required a family supper where they discussed his work, school, family vacations, or anything else except the violent abuse. Walt was careful to avoid leaving visible marks on his children. He paraded his perfect family around at Sunday church services and community events. If the children ever said anything to him about the abuse, Walt said they were just being dramatic and that they needed to be more grateful for the advantages they had, for the money he brought to the family. Meanwhile, Billy directly blamed Chris for all of this abuse. She regularly reminded Chris that when she got pregnant with him, that alone had doomed her and the family to all of this suffering. This logic is, of course, mortally flawed, but drilled into the head of a youth, it would certainly be taken as fact. The timbre only cooled consistently on one type of occasion: family camping trips. The parents never fought on these trips. The abuse halted. The parents shifted their attention to the activity at hand. They taught their children how to identify trails, how to lace up hiking boots, what kind of clothing to wear, which plants were safe to touch, and how to build a fire. Walt sang songs. He entertained the children with stories about space aliens and taught Chris how to roast marshmallows. In her book, Corinne also discusses how Chris coped with his father's abuse. After being paraded around at church or local events, forced to ignore the sufferings at home, the siblings often walked back to their house. Chris took Corinne on long detours through the woods where he reveled in the natural surroundings. Corinne writes, Chris loved to look at every type of plant, animal, and bug he hadn't seen before on the trail and point out those he did recognize. He enjoyed walking along small streams, listening to the water as it traveled and searching for eddies where we could watch the minnows scurry amongst the rocks. On one Shenandoah trip, while we were resting at a waterfall, eating our chocolate-covered granola bars and watching the water pummel the rocks below, he said, "See, Corinne? That's the purity of nature. It may be harsh in its honesty, but it never lies to you." Walt McCandless has claimed that Corinne is just lying about the abuse, that the stories are entirely fictional. I do not believe him. The viewer of this video can use their own discretion. Chris's life of privilege and luxury did not, to him, represent opportunity, but instead pain. It seems as if he reached a breaking point where he no longer found his domestic battle to be worth fighting. Instead, he simply wanted to get away. Most specifically, he yearned for the wilderness, for the only place he was ever truly happy. Much has been suggested about Chris McCandless. The most classic of these ideas has been to paint Chris's journey as one of hubris. He was an arrogant young man who did not understand nature or his own limits, and so he died in Alaska. I think this interpretation is a compound sort of failure, which does not accurately describe the protagonist of the story nor the concrete events. Chris did very well in Alaska. He survived for a very long time. As a person, it may be true that he was arrogant, but this was not a defining trait of Chris McCandless. Rather, he had an unfortunate and ultimately fatal combination of qualities: a sense of ambition unguarded by the material world, an arrogance found so commonplace in youth that it is almost unremarkable, and a childhood which poisoned his impression of contemporary society. The story and life of Chris McCandless is rife with contradictions. Chris was running from something, but he was too running towards something. He disdained the people who knew him the best, but collected a veritable family on his travels. He was prepared and skilled in survival, but consciously chose to be unequipped in the most elementary ways. A simple map would have saved his life. Years after Chris's death, his former neighbor at the trailer park described McCandless. He seemed like a kid who was looking for something, just didn't know what it was. I don't think Chris McCandless wanted to die in Alaska, but I do believe he was prepared to die. He shouldered a mortal risk which was no stranger to him. It was a risk he understood quite deeply, and the consequence of his death was one that he accepted and even embraced in his final days. Nature was his closest companion in life, and so when it came to him as death, Perhaps McCandless had found what he was searching for. Perhaps he had found peace.
Oh. That's it? Oh yeah. Vampires or Genghis Khan? That's the question. Alright.
Just in time for the holidays, there are Genghis Khan's life was steeped in blood from the very beginning. The Khan's birth was celebrated with a human sacrifice. At just 10 years old, Genghis Khan murdered his own brother. Born an impoverished peasant and left to die by his clan, the Khan went on to conquer an area larger than the continent of Africa through an unending pursuit of ruthless, total victory. His efforts made the accomplishments of Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Napoleon look like child's play. In fact, history only offers us one other individual who, born a peasant, rose to reshape the entirety of humanity around him. That is Jesus of Nazareth, perhaps Genghis Khan's only true equal. Genghis Khan has been deservedly called the most important man of the millennium. He impacted the world in ways we still feel today. The Great Khan fundamentally and permanently altered the world system, and there is even a rumor that 1% of the global population is related to Genghis Khan. We will discuss this fact and so much more later in this video. You see, Genghis Khan was not a bloodthirsty maniac. Indeed, throughout his life he displayed qualities of kindness and open-mindedness that we would all aspire to possess. But the questions remain outstanding. Who was Genghis Khan? Further, how and why did an illiterate, impoverished peasant conquer the world? This essay is not a play-by-play of Genghis's life. We will not be regarding every event and conquest and battle, but instead examining Genghis Khan the man, his methodologies, and his motivations. We will determine how he was able to soar to such great heights. In doing so, we will indeed learn much about the events of his life along the way. But to begin, we should get a simple understanding of Genghis Khan's story, even if in broad strokes. Genghis Khan was born as Temujin in about 1162. In Mongolian tradition, a child could inherit the power of a captured chieftain if that chieftain was slain and the child given his name. Temujin's father, Yasugi, did just that. He had captured a Tartar leader and likely celebrated the birth of his son with a ceremonial human sacrifice.
He's wrong.
The boy was brought up in the traditional Mongol way. He learned archery, horseback riding, and hunting in his early years. Temujin's early childhood was mostly unremarkable, but this changed radically on his 12th birthday when his father was killed. After the death of Yasuge, Temujin's clan did not have the resources to feed and take care of the now fatherless family. So they essentially exiled Temujin, his mother, and his brothers. The family was stripped of their possessions and genuinely, simply left to die on the Mongolian steppe. The eldest brother of a Mongol family was like the household emperor. Of course, this sort of despotic role would do very little in the aims of sheer survival. Perhaps Temujin perceived this, or perhaps he had just had enough of his older brother Begtur. One day, Temujin caught a large fish and Begtur stole it. Begtur cooked the fish entirely for himself rather than sharing it with the family. So in his first act of brutality, Temujin shot Begtur full of arrows, killing his own brother. Temujin was just 10 years old at the time. After the murder, Temujin was arrested by a Mongol leader named Targutai. Targutai captured the boy and held him in a sort of restrictive wooden collar. But Targutai issued only one soldier to guard the prisoner. One night, the captive Temujin snuck up on his guard, clubbed him in the head, and made his escape into the night air. When he arrived back to his family, they were only barely surviving. They remained penniless and without food. Never one to be ruled by circumstance, Temujin spent the next years building himself into a young Mongol warlord. This eventually led to Temujin meeting his first wife, a young woman named Borte. The two were very much in love. It would prove to be the greatest love of Temujin's life. However, tragedy struck when Borte was kidnapped by a group of rival Mongols. This incident became the impetus for Temujin to grow from fledgling warlord to outright leader of men. Still a teenager, Temujin rallied clans of Mongols to go reclaim Borte. The success he had in these efforts was remarkable. The official Mongol historical claim is that Temujin led 500,000 men to go reclaim his wife. This is surely exaggerated, but the coalition Temujin assembled was immense. The proceeding battle was a full, total, outright victory for Temujin, one which resulted in him saving Borte. But when he reunited with his wife, she was pregnant with another man's child. Showing great integrity, Temujin declared that she was his wife, and so the child was his son. Indeed, Temujin would go on to raise this child as his own. Temujin would have liked to simply return home with Borte, retire from warlording, and live a quiet pastoral life. But by this time he was just in too deep. He had pledged lifelong alliance to other leaders and had a veritable army of men acting under his own banner. Retirement just wasn't an option. Furthermore, Temujin had within him a red-hot sense of ambition. Even as a teenager, he was aiming towards entire supremacy over the Mongols. Temujin led his newfound army all over the steppe in an effective and ambitious plan to eliminate all of his rivals. The actions which followed and surrounded these conquests were brutal. Indeed, the word genocidal could accurately describe Temujin as his hordes swept through Asia. He was entirely successful in his pursuits. He was soon affirmed with the title GengisKhan, which meant something like universal ruler. In the decades which followed, the new Khan would conquer land in a way humanity had never conceived. But how? How was an impoverished, illiterate peasant able to conquer an entire continent? This comes down to three things: the Khan's personal qualities, his incredible military genius, and his innate ability to operate a society. Throughout history, a lot of people have been conquerors. A lot of people wiped out massive populations, took land, and secured their spots in the canon of humanity. But Genghis Khan is singular. He is unlike any to have come before, and probably to ever come again. The Han had what we would call talent. Some can sing, some can dance, and others can build nations. But in Mongolia, there is a spiritual idea which says we all have a wild horse inside of us, a sort of spirit animal. In life, we must learn how to tame and ride this horse so that we can be propelled to our highest potential. Many people spend their whole lives trying to tame this horse and failing to do so. Consider the types of individuals who possess endless, never-to-be-fulfilled plans and ambitions. Genghis Khan, to the Mongols, had mastered his wild horse on a truly profound level. Of course, we can look to less abstract personal qualities to better understand the man himself. Genghis Khan placed a tremendous importance on loyalty. He practically started a small war to reclaim his first wife, Borte. Although he took many other wives throughout his life, as was custom, Genghis remained married to Borte until he died. This loyalty bled through to his life as a conqueror as well. Genghis Khan spent part of his life fighting against a man named Jamuka. When it seemed clear that Han would emerge victorious, Jamuka's men turned him over to Genghis Khan and surrendered themselves. In response, the Han killed all of Jamuka's men as punishment for disloyalty to their own leader. This loyalty was not just to the individual, but to the Han's law and word. Under Han's law, if a city capitulated to the Mongols, they would be unharmed. In one instance, he found out that one of his sons had robbed a citizen from a city who had surrendered to the Han's forces. Genghis stripped that son of his rank in the military and demoted him to the lowest position in the army. He forced his son to fight on the frontmost line of the next battle, and the son was quickly killed. Above most other things, Genghis Khan was resilient. Indeed, he had this resilience in his very blood. He was left on the steppe to die, and yet through sheer grit and under the tutelage of his mother, the Han did so much more than survive. Throughout his career, Genghis Khan suffered setback after setback, but he never suffered destruction. The Han identified his weaknesses and faults, corrected them, and continuously pushed forward. Even when he should have been on his deathbed, succumbing to internal bleeding from a fall from his horse, Genghis Khan fought on. He continued to raid and conquer through Asia. Genghis Khan was too immensely charismatic. He had a lifelong tendency to listen to the opinions of others, and he generally was quite a good judge of character and intention. Whatever kindness was issued to the Han was typically repaid, and then some. This was in no small part how Genghis was able to repeatedly rally men and even armies to his own banner. The Han was too a generous man. In one famous incident, he saw a peasant laboring in the sun on a hot summer's day. Struck by empathy, Genghis Khan issued a pardon to the peasant, freeing him immediately for life from all taxes and forced labor. In another episode, Genghis's hordes won a battle with an enemy city. The adolescent son of the city's governor managed to save his own home. The young boy told Genghis that the governor wanted to surrender rather than fight, but had been overruled by his military. The Han immediately adopted the now fatherless boy. Genghis Khan was a conqueror. He killed many, many people and razed hundreds of cities. But even still, the Han was not considered remarkably or especially cruel in his time. When we look at other figures in history, like Henry VIII, who were perceived as bloodthirsty maniacs by their contemporaries, we find a remarkable distance from the Han. Even the Han's closest neighbors, the Persians and Jin Chinese, had reputations for immense cruelty, which Genghis did not. Up to this point, we have an idealized image of Genghis Khan. With the aforementioned profile, the Han who emerges is a resilient, loyal, charismatic figure with no small amount of goodwill. But this is only a partially accurate version of the man. There isn't a lot to suggest that Genghis Khan was himself a gifted soldier. Instead, his success in warfare came from his ability to recognize and organize talent. He had an incredible collection of generals and an uncanny ability to deploy them appropriately. Perhaps this is not the most damning quality to have. One could argue it is mostly good. The Han was presumably able to see his own faults and work around them. Certainly his lack of talent as a soldier never slowed down his conquering ambitions. The Han often found victory through outright treachery or outsmarting his opponent. He employed an array of clever psychological trickery in his warfare, and on more than one occasion sheer luck seemed to be well on his side. Indeed, the original Mongolian text which tells us of the Han's life goes to great lengths to communicate this idea, to tell us that planning, cunning, and simple good luck were all critical to Genghis's success. The Han was intensely paranoid. As the historian Frank McLynn has noted, Genghis's, quote, attitude towards his own kin was suspicious at best and malevolent at worst. Genghis devoted significant amounts of time to uncovering conspiratorial plots amongst his men, only a few of which turned out to be genuine. In one instance, Genghis executed 12 of his soldiers out of suspicion that one of them might have been disloyal. He was also prepared to kill one of his own brothers without trial after a series of vague rumors and accusations. The Han's paranoia unfortunately paired with regular bouts of uncontrollable, unprovoked rage. These episodes were often focused on his own men. In the 1220s, the Han hired a scribe and dictated a letter which was to be sent to Persia. The scribe was something of a diplomat and a master of the Persian language and culture, so he paraphrased the Han's words, adding in Persian colloquialisms and a tone of necessary flattery to its recipient. Genghis had the letter translated into Mongolian and read back to him. Upon discovering the scribe's stylistic choices, which were again reasonable, the Han called the scribe a traitor and had him immediately executed. In another incident, Genghis Khan suspected one of his wives of being unfaithful, and he immediately had her tortured, nearly to death, on the suspicion alone. These outbursts of rage were made even more unjustifiable by Genghis's insistence that his men remain forever stoic. The Han, in fact, had a standing law which specifically required the Mongol forces to not show their emotions. When one of the Han's sons suffered the loss of his child, Genghis prohibited him from any kind of outward mourning. Last, although certainly not least, Genghis Khan was a murderer of men. We are right to couch this label in the context of his time and his status as a conqueror. It is also true that his tendency for brutality was not especially remarkable by the standards of his time. But the fact remains that Genghis Khan is responsible for millions of deaths. We will later examine this number in a more precise way, but for now, as we discuss the Han's less agreeable traits, his mass murdering must be considered. There are a few incidents which speak to the Han's prodigious use of violence. It is said that Genghis once poured molten lead into the mouth of a conquered governor. There is also a tale which says as the Khan was raiding a rival clan, an old woman swallowed some valuable pearls to prevent Genghis from taking them. The Han proceeded to slice her open and retrieve the pearls from her dead body. While either of these specific events may be legend or fact, Genghis was never one to shy away from brutality. So in fact, the Han was neither an amiable, empathetic leader or a rage-fueled maniac. He was perhaps both. As we examine his strategies on the battlefield, we can see how his complex personality went remarkably well to his warring ambitions. In battle, Genghis Khan's strategy was based on total victory. Warfare as he saw it was not some sporting affair wherein two parties needed to abide by a set of rules. It was a quest for annihilation. As noted Han scholar Jack Weatherford has said, quote, victory did not come to the one who played by the rules. It came to the one who made the rules and imposed them on his enemy. Before moving to conquer a city, Genghis Khan would announce that if his enemy surrendered, everyone would be safe. The invasion would be painless. The conquered city would just pay taxes to the Mongol Empire instead of their current leader, and life would go on as normal. Many cities took Genghis Khan up on this offer, and the conqueror never once broke his word. However, if the city resisted, Genghis Khan told them they would all die. He would be ruthless, and he would wipe out anyone who even attempted hostility. Most remarkably, this included the wealthy aristocratic elites. At the time, the wartime killing of elite society was something of a taboo. The so-called civilized belief was, fine, kill the poor and the workers, but you can't kill the aristocrats. However, by the Han's estimation, these elites could not even defend themselves against the Mongols, so what use did he have for them in his empire? This approach, this willingness to break the rules of traditional warfare, painted Han as a barbarian in the eyes of his enemies, a label which has largely stuck with him in modernity. One problem was that the Han had a relatively small, roving army. He didn't really have administrators, so once his people left conquered cities, those citizens could revolt quite easily. If this happened, and it did on occasion, the Han turned his army around and killed all of the conquered people. Throughout the history of warfare, leaders have generally used the methods of war which are produced by their culture. These things present a sort of toolbox from which they operate in wartime. Mongols raided around the steppe and they fought one another, but as a people, they had never even conceived of continental domination. Genghis Khan himself was a nobody from nowhere with no conception of traditional warfare strategies by the Mongols or otherwise. So when he began to warlord through the continent, he was forced to become a true innovator. We can see this in one of his very first conquests. When the Han was a young warlord, he traveled to China. It was the first time he'd encountered a city. Given his background on the steppe, it was perhaps the first time he'd even seen a wall. The Han noticed the complex Chinese irrigation system by which the city had rechanneled a river. He thought if they could rechannel a river and use its great force for irrigation, he could rechannel a river to take down their walls. The Han had no weapons of war, so he told his men to start digging a canal towards the walls. This all went very poorly. The river flooded the Han's camp, but he repeated the tactic, and next time it worked, and it did tear down a city's walls. This was a pattern. Genghis Khan truly learned from his enemies and his failures. The Han never believed himself so omniscient that there was nothing he could be taught. He took blame for his failures, and he did not repeat them. But much more so than innovation, the Han's tendency to assimilate was a major source of his success. He didn't really develop new weapons at all. Instead, Genghis Khan took from a diverse group of people. When he encountered a strategy or tool which could serve his army, the Han incorporated it into his forces. This led to a diverse amalgamation of weapons within the Mongol army, all borrowed from disparate cultures, but now used for the first time under a single leader. The Mongols had siege weapons like catapults, trebuchets, and mangonels to hurl stones at enemies, but they also used these devices to throw pots of burning fuel, explosives, and flammable liquids which would be ignited by flaming arrows. They built massive crossbows on wheels. The Mongols pushed portable towers for long-range attacks. All the while, Mongol soldiers dug beneath the earth to engage in a sort of proto-trench warfare. To serve both function and psychological warfare, Mongols piled captured soldiers into enemy moats as human bridges over which they could push wheeled weapons. This was how the Han won, all-out ruthless onslaught. One victim of a Mongol invasion described the events as, quote, a red-hot furnace fed from without by hard sticks thrust into the recesses, while from the belly of the furnace sparks shoot into the air, before his men were quickly, quote, drowned in the sea of annihilation. Now it's tempting to think that the Mongols were pure bronze, a horde of simple brute force terror. But this isn't quite true. The Han also engaged heavily in psychological warfare. For example, before approaching a city, the Mongols would deploy a few messengers to the area who would spend weeks spreading rumors about the size and brutality of the Mongolian army. On some occasions, the Han would instruct his men to light 4 or 5 fires each at camp nightfall. This would make it appear as if the soon invading forces were several times larger than they really were. It would be an understatement to say that the Mongols were and still are incredible equestrians. They were all but raised on horseback, and by the time a Mongol child reached adolescence, he was an expert horseman. The Han put this skill to great use on the battlefield. In battle, Mongolians employed a technique of rapid movement, assaulting the enemy from all sides on horseback, which made the Mongol army appear much larger than a traditional formation. The Han also had a strategy wherein a group of men on horseback would ride far back from the battlefield and speed towards the conflict. This gave the impression the Mongols had incoming reinforcements, demoralizing and panicking the enemy. The Han even employed psychological warfare in the weapons he used. The Mongolians developed a type of arrow with perforations in the arrowhead which amplified the whistling sound they made as they flew through the air. As enemies ducked for cover, they could only hear the arrows, and such a cacophony fraudulently promised that thousands more were on the way. Just this threat could cause enemies to break formation, making it easy for the Mongols to decimate in battle. Another moment of the Han's brilliance came when the Mongols set out to attack the walled city of Ryazan. By this time, the Mongols had a huge number of laborers in their forces. These men cut down trees, transported them to Mongol lines, and built a new wall which completely surrounded the already walled enemy city. The Mongol construction prevented the city's defenders from sending out troops or destroying any of the Han's siege machines. It also stopped any reinforcements or supplies from entering the city. The people in Ryazan were trapped and stricken with the horrifying reality that there was absolutely no way to escape. Furthermore, the enemy could not even see the Mongol attack as it came. Indeed, the Mongols proceeded to take the city with ease, using ranged weapons and siege machines from behind their wall. Personal qualities and warfare talent were fine, but the Han also needed to maintain order in his newly conquered lands. Certainly without prosperity, his empire would have been radically short-lived. But fortunately for the Mongols, the Han's talent indeed appeared again. I think one of the most profoundly true things about Genghis Khan was his practicality. He did not quest for personal greatness or material gain. Instead, he wished only for the prosperity of his people. This was expressed in virtually every decision he made for the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan was a deeply religious man throughout his life, ascribing to a sort of Mongolian shaman tradition. He worshipped the mountain on which he was born and that same sky above his birthplace. Although his specific religious beliefs grew and changed through his life, Genghis would regularly return to this mountain and pray in solitude for days at a time. Despite his relatively strict religious beliefs, Genghis Khan granted religious freedom to everyone in his empire. Like you will see with so many of his policies, this was not out of some humanitarian altruism. Instead, it was simply to reduce conflict and infighting within the empire. It was also a way to attract people to life under the Mongol banner. Cities in the Mongol Empire were some of the most religiously free in the world. Genghis Khan even held debates wherein religious leaders could discuss theological issues. These subjects included good versus evil, the nature of God, and the prospect of an afterlife. Importantly, these debates never really had winners. The Han believed, in his words, that each religion was like the finger of a hand. Mankind was better off with all represented and intact. There is a modern sort of rumor that the Han mandated women's rights in his empire. This is true, but again not out of any altruism or proto-feminism. Kidnapping women and taking them for wives was, for a long time, a traditional part of the Mongol society. But Genghis Khan identified, and indeed knew firsthand, that this caused little more than infighting. Someone kidnapped a wife, retaliation came, then retaliation for retaliation, etc., etc. So one of the Han's first laws was to prohibit the sale and kidnapping of women. This was purely practical. It was an effort, and an effective one, to reduce warfare amongst disparate Mongol tribes. These types of social developments were largely functional, rather than built out of principle. But Genghis Khan was, too, an immensely principled leader. One of his strongest beliefs was in merit. Genghis ensured that to live, work, or fight in the Mongol Empire was to exist in a pure meritocracy. Being a man from nowhere and nothing himself, Genghis perceived that it was not the birth of an individual that mattered, but the capability. If a captured city did not capitulate, all of those who resisted would die. However, the Han spared skilled workers like merchants, scribes, and basket weavers. Unskilled people who had not resisted his invasion were put to work in dangerous military construction roles. Genghis Khan had no interest whatsoever in material gains, famously saying, quote, "I wear the same clothing and eat the same food as cow herds and horse herders. We make the same sacrifices, and we share the riches." In a more succinct quote, Genghis Khan expressed his opinion on the matter, saying, "I hate luxury." This was more than just aesthetics for Genghis. He once declared that the eternal blue sky had condemned those people he conquered because of their, quote, haughtiness and their extravagant luxury. And like most other ideals, this disdain for luxury had a functional purpose in the Han's empire. While he had no interest in personal wealth, the Han wanted to make the Mongolian Empire prosperous. He believed that the exchange of money and goods was the best way to ensure prosperity for a people. Of course, massive fortune came his way as he conquered throughout Asia. But Genghis Khan simply gave it all away. He believed that the circulation of riches would help his empire more than him just accumulating wealth. Indeed, much of his conquering was in this interest, rather than personal glory or greed. For example, Genghis Khan saw the tremendous wealth that was in circulation via the now famous Silk Road in China. He wanted this trade route to fuel the Mongols, wanted his empire to be the beneficiary of all this commerce. So he tried several times to draft trade agreements with the Chinese. They repeatedly broke each of these agreements, and so seeing that it was the only way to control Chinese trade, Genghis Khan conquered the nation of China. Merchants also had a tremendous role in Genghis's empire. Along Mongolian trade routes, Genghis set up small stands where merchants could receive free food and horses for their journey. When he conquered hostile cities, merchants were rarely executed, but instead assigned to work within the Mongol Empire. So we now know of Genghis Khan as he lived, breathed, conquered, and ruled. But what of the Han in death? What did he leave humanity? In 1227, Genghis Khan was riding on horseback, hunting wild horses in the Gobi. The Han was on a particularly temperamental horse, which bucked suddenly and threw him to the ground. This caused some sort of internal injury to the Han, who quickly came down with a serious fever. The Han refused medical care, instead continuing with his conquests across Asia. 6 months after the accident, Genghis Khan succumbed to his injuries and died. Details on the place and circumstances are mostly unknown. Historical record basically stops with the fall from his horse. Certainly, historical events and figures are always subject to perspectives, debate, and disagreement, but there can be little doubt that Genghis Khan was the single greatest conqueror our world has ever seen. Historian Frank McLynn offers a staggering description of the Han's empire. Genghis Khan and his sons vanquished peoples from the Adriatic to the Pacific. The Mongols eventually reached Austria, Finland, Croatia, Hungary, Poland, Vietnam, Burma, Japan, and Indonesia. His empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Arctic Ocean. Mongol influence extended as far as Mali in Africa. The Mongol Empire covered 12 million contiguous square miles, an area as large as Africa and bigger than North America. By contrast, the extent of the Roman Empire was about half that of the continental USA. By 1240, Mongol conquests covered most of the known world, and even at Genghis's death in 1227, embraced more than half of this world. The modern population of the countries ruled by the empire at its greatest extent contain 3 billion of the world's 7 billion population. Consider, as McLynn notes, that this all came from nothing. Alexander the Great's father built a military apparatus for him. Julius Caesar entered the world with 3 centuries of Roman military dominance to call upon. Even Napoleon came from a long line of advanced military tradition. Genghis Khan was born in a tent. Alexander the Great's teacher was none other than Aristotle. Julius Caesar was taught by the Roman education system, which was the greatest humanity had to offer. Napoleon could and did find wisdom in the mass of European Romantic era works. Genghis Khan never learned to read or write. Genghis Khan did not just bring his nomadic people to near global domination. He recognized that this was even possible, despite there being absolutely nothing to indicate as much. The conqueror invented a culture and solved massive, unforeseen societal and political problems from nothing but thin air and force of will. In a time when xenophobia was ingrained into the mind of humanity, Genghis Khan was unshackled by the fear of the other. He embraced new ideas, tactics, and cultures, both out of conquering ambition and pure personal interest. Genghis Khan was an awesome man. His deeds were too awesome, in the most terrible and violent sense of the word. There has been much conversation and study about the Mongols' violence, specifically what amount of death they can be credited with. Of course, as to be expected, there exist extremes in thought. Some say the Mongols' death counts have been overblown to absurdity, while others would be happy to rank them generationally in the billions. It's very difficult to say how many people the Mongols really killed under Genghis Khan's reign. As a general rule, determining wartime death counts is always difficult. Even recent conflicts provide us with estimates and often wide ranges. This becomes even more complicated when we examine historical peoples. Ancient sources multiply death counts for the sake of propaganda in one direction or the other. Meanwhile, contemporary scholars are often too conservative, sometimes letting skepticism pull their numbers into outright falsehood. Death counts, further, are generally predicated on reliable population statistics. Ancient sources certainly do not provide these. We will turn again to the historian McLynn. If you would like to see the entirety of his methodology, it is on screen now. Taking into account all of the known events and populations, McLynn puts the Mongol death toll in Russia and Europe somewhere near 1 million. After adding this in with the much more significant Asian events and minor wars, McLynn gets to his total number. By his educated estimate, Genghis Khan was responsible for a truly astounding 37.5 million deaths. One of the Han's closest advisors once described the Mongol warfare strategy as this: "The basis of the state is the people. If, when a country has been conquered, the population is then murdered, what advantage does the state have? Moreover, if the innocent are killed, this simply stiffens the enemy's will to resist. This is not in accord with the leader's wishes." This would seem to fly in the face of the Mongols' massive death toll, but we must remember the Han's everlasting surrender or die policy. The early Mongol army and population were relatively small. As such, they were very likely concerned with their own numbers, with sustaining. A complete and utter decimation of the enemy would have been the best way to reduce Mongol casualties. Further, the Mongols basically saw Genghis Khan as having a divine right. In Mongol legend, he was the product of an immaculate conception. The Han was literally heaven sent to bring the Mongol people to their apex. Resisting the Mongol hordes was basically resisting God himself. It was an act of blasphemy. With this in mind, it's easy to imagine why the Mongols were so willing to kill. While there's nothing to suggest that Genghis Khan propagandized or exalted himself as some divine being, it was certainly a motivating idea within his forces. Now, even by ancient standards, it is difficult to justify the massacre of nearly 40 million people. By modern thought, this is impossible to justify. But certainly the Han was a mostly pragmatic man. He did not kill for the sake of killing, and indeed his brutality had both function and results, some of which can certainly be described as positive. Many scholars believe that the Han ushered in an era called the Pax Mongolica, which was a long-lasting peace and prosperity in Eurasia. During this time, it was said that you could travel from Palestine to Mongolia with a gold plate on your head and not be bothered. Other historians believe that this Pax Mongolica was either a very short-lived peace or, in fact, did not happen at all. Regardless of this disagreement, it can be said with certainty that the Mongol Empire single-handedly linked two continents together in a way which proved to be permanent. During the Crusades, Europe had come into contact with the Islamic world, but still European presence and influence functionally ended at Jerusalem. As Genghis Khan conquered China, he was becoming convinced that agriculture would generate more prosperity for his empire than nomadism. The Mongols would grow crops and trade them along a massive network of trade routes, including those which led to the Islamic world, which now had some European presence. So the Han brought Asia into contact with the Middle East and thus with Europe. This is more than just retrospective theory. At various times there were Mongolian envoys present in France and England, and French workers operating in the Mongol capital. The Han's trade routes and the commerce which flowed on them were so great they essentially held the very system of the world together. The knowledge of firearms, silk, ceramics, and woodblock printing all came to Europe from Asia on trade routes propagated by Genghis Khan himself. Unfortunately, the Han's propensity for trade had negative effects as well. Rinderpest is an animal disease similar to human measles. This illness wiped out huge amounts of livestock after being spread by Mongol conquests and trade. However, this pales in comparison to what recent research has revealed. Evidence of the Black Plague has been found in Central Asia, which predates the disease's European presence by a decade. It is very likely the Mongols, or their trade routes, spread the Black Plague to Europe. There's an often told rumor that some 0.5% or 1% or 2% of people alive today are descendants of Genghis Khan as a result of the Han's prodigious procreation. Historians and Mongol scholars widely reject this claim. The idea is made quite fraudulent when we consider that scientists have no DNA from Genghis Khan himself. There is no way to check if any DNA matches the Han's because we don't have any of his. Genghis Khan was a famous man and he had many children, but these descendants were very well documented. As late as the 1500s, there was only one remaining male direct descendant of Genghis Khan. Then, when Mongolia fell under the rule of the USSR, the party killed every descendant of the Han they could find. So, if anything, there has been a historical shortage of Genghis's blood in the centuries that followed his life. It should also be said that once the Mongols conquered China, they were forbidden from marrying the Chinese. More broadly, the Mongols generally married and had children with one another. They did not really procreate with conquered people. While we can't say this precludes exceptions, intercourse, or law-breaking, it certainly puts a dent in the idea of mass breeding on the part of the Mongols. The study which originally revealed this ostensible factoid does not actually support its own conclusion either. The participating scientists did find a genetic marker in common throughout 8 million men in Central Asia, but they didn't find evidence to indicate that this marker came from Genghis Khan. The claim represents an enormous leap in logic to say that because this trait is shared and Asian, it must have come from the Han. Indeed, more recent studies have completely disproven this whole theory. The Mongol Empire was truly a doomed venture. The Mongols were a few people. At the empire's height, the ratio of Mongols to conquered peoples was 1 to 100. The sheer weight of this population meant that the empire was simply too large for the Mongols to maintain indefinitely. With such an outsized number of subjects to rulers, rebellion would mean a certain victory for the captured population. Indeed, the Mongols' greatest weapon was in their agility and mobility. They were a pastoral force who moved quickly around land on horseback. It became clear that agriculture and civilization were the way forward for an empire at this scale. So as the Mongols began to pursue this way of life and abandon their nomadism, they abandoned the very things which made them so effective. Indeed, the empire did eventually crumble, due to these factors and due to the Han waning from his merit-based conviction at the end of his life. He turned his empire over to his sons, who proved to lack much of the great Han's leadership abilities. Genghis Khan is a man today with many reputations. To some, he was a genocidal barbarian who brought waves of blood across the world. For others, he was a great man who united millions of disparate people and paved the way for Asia as it exists today. In fact, he is both, and he is everything in between. Born an anonymous, illiterate peasant, Genghis Khan went on to build the largest empire humankind has ever seen in just a few short decades. But he did this through ruthlessly massacring millions of people. So indeed, as it often goes in history, the greatest men are too the most terrible.
That's it. All right. What's this one about vampires? I have no idea, but vampires. What?
This video is brought to you by Mubi, a cure at moose and folklore, main fiction. This isn't exactly correct. In history and folklore, vampires occupy a space that is quite similar to witches. For many centuries, people did not believe in vampires. These undead creatures simply were real. They were facts of life, as real as the grass and the sky. There has been vampire frenzy, vampire hunts, and large-scale disasters attributed to the work of vampires. European royals have been accused of vampirism. Government officials have traveled hundreds of miles to investigate reports of vampire outbreaks. However, these real vampires did not look like this. They did not bite people's necks, nor did they turn into bats. Our modern ideation of the vampire is in truth scores away from its folkloric origins in Eastern Europe. In making this video, I am asking the viewer to erase all of their preconceived notions about the vampire and begin with a blank canvas. In this documentary, we will investigate many things. We will do so mostly in the context of those earlier people who accepted vampires as reality. What did the vampire look like? What did it do? How did earlier people find, hunt, and kill the vampire? Furthermore, we can see how and why the vampire strayed so far from its origins and how modern science can explain early claims of vampiric outbreaks. Of course, like any story worth telling, we must start at the beginning. Investigating the word vampire is not a simple task, but this task does provide us with a lot of insight on the creatures of folklore. There's no broad consensus on the etymology of vampire. There are instead many theories. Louis Berkowski is a leading researcher on the folklore of these undead beings. In his book The Darkling, Berkowski suggests the word vampire has its roots in the old Russian name Upir, specifically with that name being a cognate of the Serbo-Croatian vampir. The old Iranian religion of Manichaeism features a god called Bam, who is said to carve a tomb as the grave of darkness. Slavonic is a term used to describe the family of Eastern European languages. In Slavonic, Bam would be pronounced Vam. The Slavonic name Bir means a drinking bout. So we could get something like Van Bir, which would be a combination of a tomb of darkness and a drinking bout. However, there's not much research to indicate that Manichaeism ever made its way to Slavic countries. A more detailed analysis shows that the old Russian name Upiri comes from the Latin impurus, which means unclean, specifically in reference to a corpse. This feels most like an origin point. Vampires are primarily revenants, that is, bodies who have risen from the dead. We can also see other Slavonic variants of the same name, including the Bulgarian Vapir, the Ruthenian Vepir or Vopir, the Russian Upir or Upur, and the Polish Upirior. We can also get some insight from looking at the world of werewolves, another common creature in Eastern European folklore. Much of the lore surrounding these two creatures overlaps in significant ways. Vampires and werewolves often have the same abilities or even origin stories. Serbian vampires and werewolves were both called vukodlak, which is a 13th century term for a wolf pelt wearer. Greeks also referred to vampires as vrkolakes, but record shows this word is borrowed from the Serbian language. In this instance, etymology is a very imprecise science. Vampire, as an English term, first emerged in the 1730s, and we don't really know how. The word is the result of a rather unknowable, ever-changing stew of Slavonic terms. As we will see, this is a recurring theme in the story of the vampire. They are creatures which prove to be incredibly malleable in almost all facets. Before we proceed, there's something we must discuss. Vampires exist in non-European cultures. There are vampiric legends in Chinese, Indian, Native American, and South American legends. While I will not ignore these outright, I must say that an essay covering every single vampire in every single culture would be a truly monumental effort. The resulting video would be one that does not span hours, but days or even weeks. In the interest of palatability and publishing, an author must focus on something more specific. This video, like all of my videos, is also based on what I find personally interesting. Lastly, I do feel that the European vampire best represents the vampire of our modern culture. So from a combination of logistics, personal interest, and what feels appropriate, I will be focusing on the European vampire specifically. The idea of an undead or magical being drinking blood is nothing new. Lilith was biblically described as the first female demon said to drink the blood of children. Indeed, in some obscure translations, her name has been expressed as vampire. Ancient Romans proliferated a rumor that the Germanic Goth people consumed blood. Grendel from the epic poem Beowulf drinks blood. 15th century witches likewise were said to consume the blood of mortals. But none of these are vampires in earnest, and so we reach our first hurdle. We cannot pinpoint one group or persons originating the idea of a vampire. But in the early 14th century, Serbians were known to exhume the bodies of suspected vampires and cremate them. Some 300 years before the English word vampire existed, Serbian Emperor Stefan Dusan enacted the following legislation. When it happens that by magic means people are taken out of their graves and cremated, the village where that was done must pay a fine, and the priest who came to the cremation must be deprived of his vocation. We cannot either say why or how any individual came up with the concept of a vampire. Early people were subject to tragedies which they could not have possibly understood: disease, famine, natural disasters. It seems that vampires probably formed as a reaction to these incidents, disease in particular. When epidemics swept through villages, the vampire was provided as likely cause. Slavic peoples believed that the undead would rise from their graves, wreak havoc on the village, and spread pestilence through the land. In exhuming graves and cremating suspected vampires, they hoped to halt these occurrences. As I wrote this, I was racked with the question of why. Why would these people believe such a thing? I've come to understand that, like many folk beliefs, this is kind of the wrong framing. It is science which leads us to ask why, and generally speaking, science basically didn't exist at the time, at least certainly not in a capacity which resembles today's science. I think it is more helpful to take these beliefs as consequences of their time. We should not expect proof to the concept, but instead accept that lack of proof to the contrary was plenty in these earlier times. Certainly this way of thinking provided the landscape for Europe's first vampires. There are a few accounts which catapulted vampires from the backwoods of Eastern Europe into mainstream European society. The most famous and perhaps most influential is the Powell account. In the early 1700s, reports arrived to the Serbian capital of a vampire tormenting a nearby village. The government dispatched police and medical officials to investigate. This is what they found. Arnold Powell was a Serbian soldier who lived in a small village, likely near modern-day Kosovo. Powell recollected being harassed by a vampire in Turkish Siberia when he was a soldier. To deter the vampire, he ate earth from the vampire's grave and smeared himself with the vampire's blood, likely stolen from that grave. This was a story he recounted many times to virtually anyone who would hear it in his village. Years later, in 1726, Powell fell from his wagon in Kosovo. He broke his neck and died. After his death, villagers complained that they were still being bothered by Powell at night. Indeed, the village claimed that 4 people had been killed by Powell up to 30 days after his death. The alleged vampire also attacked cattle and drank their blood. When the villagers ate meat from these cattle, 17 people died in just 3 days. A girl named Stanaska reported that she was attacked by one of the dead and throttled in her sleep. After the attack, Stanaska experienced chest pains. She fell ill and she died on the 3rd day of her affliction. The villagers dug up Powell and found his body entirely undecayed. Fresh blood was flowing from his eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. He had freshly grown fingernails and skin that looked undisturbed and undecayed. The corpse met all of the qualifications for a vampire, so they drove a stake into his heart. Powell's corpse bled copiously, and allegedly he groaned in pain. The villagers burned the body and threw the ashes onto his grave. They then exhumed all of the bodies of those who had died. They found 14 corpses of all ages and genders showing the same signs of vampirism. This report was eventually sent to a magazine called Glanur Historique, where it caught the attention of mainstream European society. Alongside the Powell report, another story soon followed to help ignite the European vampire frenzy. In 1725, a report came to the desk of a medical officer named Frombald in Vienna. It claimed a corpse in a Serbian village had risen from its grave to strangle victims and infect them with a condition that caused immediate death. This report mirrors the Powell incident in many ways, but in Frombald's we have the first European example of the term vampiri. Frombald used this word to describe the undead corpse and his victims. So perhaps our vampire was born. Vampire obsession spread across Europe. In 1732, 12 books and 4 dissertations were published about vampires. 22 papers were further published and circulated around European cultural centers like Amsterdam, Leipzig, and Vienna. There were poems, stories, and novels published with vampiric themes. If ever there was a golden age for the vampire, this was it. At one point, there were widely accepted rumors that the Princess of Vienna had risen as a vampire after her recent death. When stories spread in Paris that Louis XV had kidnapped children to drink their blood, riots broke out and 20 people died. Fueling all of this, reports of vampire outbreaks from these Slavic countries came inbounding to Europe like never before. This was happening amid a swirl of circumstances which made Europe rife for vampiric fascination. In the era, Europe was making great strides in medicine and science. The intelligentsia was constantly looking for new puzzles to solve. Vampires were an ideal candidate. It could be argued that if Europe didn't solve the vampire, this failure would bring into question much of their supposed scientific progress. The vampire spread disease in a time of alleged medical breakthroughs. This alone was problematic enough. But the vampire's hallmark ability to rise from the dead, its status as neither dead nor alive, these things defied the very foundations of so exalted European science. One common proposition was that drug use caused vampirism. German historian Johann Christoph Herrenberg linked vampire outbreaks to the use of opium and a drug called datura. Although not strictly a hallucinogen, datura does cause auditory and visual delusions, which Herrenberg believed could compel one to vampirism. There was a broader idea that vampirism was caused by consuming a number of materials, poisonous plants, tainted meat, or just an unhealthy diet being the most likely. Another man named de Boyer proposed that blood found in the bodies of alleged vampires was the result of body fluids mixing with nitrogen in the earth after burial. Indeed, there had been reports from years prior that certain soil could produce abnormal forms of body decomposition. A Lutheran pastor suggested that vampirism was caused by rats and vermin infiltrating coffins and somehow maintaining a level of consciousness in the deceased. Even those who rejected vampires as superstition did so with the qualification that vampire outbreaks were indeed real, but caused by mass hysteria or psychological disturbance. One of the Roman Empress Maria Theresa's closest advisors was Gerard van Swieten. He was given the duty of drafting a treatise on vampirism. Van Swieten's conclusion was that the Slavic people were barbaric primitives who were more susceptible to mass hysteria. It was the duty of advanced peoples like his to civilize these groups. Indeed, the Empress decreed that vampires were figments of the imagination. At this time, vampires were firmly rooted in their folkloric roots. They had not been adopted entirely by fictional works, nor had the folklore been manipulated for the sake of good fictional storytelling. This is precisely the vampire which this video seeks to investigate. What was a vampire? What does the folklore tell us? And what of our modern vampire is contemporary invention? Furthermore, how can modern science explain these early vampiric outbreaks? Well, throughout all folklore, descriptions of vampires, their abilities, and everything else varies widely. But if we regard all of these and produce something of an average, we can understand the folkloric vampire and the world in which he lived. In folklore, people generally did not find vampires walking around. Instead, they suspected a dead person of being a vampire, exhumed the body, and examined it for signs of vampirism. So as we typify vampires here, remember that these are things found on corpses, typically not on the moving, living human body. Today, our vampires have a wide range of appearances. They may be dashingly good-looking, outright monstrous, or anywhere in between. But Slavonic folklore provides us with a pretty exact physical description of the vampire. So we will first examine this description and then pose it against some modern scientific explanations. Vampires were not the pallid corpse-like figures of Dracula and Nosferatu. In fact, the corpse of a vampire was usually described as healthy or even darker in color than the living, with the face occasionally being lighter in tone. Some Yugoslavian accounts even say the vampire was a dark blue color. One old world Serbian described the reddened face of a local alcoholic being blood red as a vampire. It was believed that this darker than normal appearance came from the vampire drinking blood. It was often noted that vampires had blood at the mouth when exhumed. To earlier people, this blood indicated that the corpse had been drinking blood. Additionally, the blood of a vampire was still liquid rather than the coagulated jelly which typically comes with human decomposition. There are accounts of dead bodies being staked only to gush with liquid blood. In most Slavonic cultures, this was a surefire way to diagnose a vampire. Across virtually all early vampiric accounts, the bodies of these undead were said to be grotesquely swollen. A Greek text notes of their virgolikas, it is an infallible sign of a vampire when the body does not decompose in the grave, but instead swells up while the skin becomes taut like the skin of a drum. A Serbian account reads, "When he is dug up, he will be bloated with blood and uncorrupted." Meanwhile, the South Slavic assessment of vampires included this: the vampire has no bones, but is a blood-filled sac that comes into being when the devil pulls the skin off a particular body and blows it up. So rather than the human-like or outright bestial appearance of today's vampires, early revenants were somewhere in the middle. They resembled humans, but with darker skin and bulbous, swollen bodies. There were a number of other vampiric hallmarks. The corpse's nails would be regrown and appear healthy. The skin likewise, with observers recording that the corpse seems to have shed its old skin and grown a new one. The liver was white in color. The mouth and or eyes may have been open. You may notice that teeth have not been discussed. This is for good reason. According to folklore and Slavonic records, sharpened teeth were not relevant or existent in vampires. The long, razor-sharp canines are an invention of modern fiction. In fact, some folkloric vampires did not even use their teeth to drink blood. The Russian vampire had a pointed, sharpened tongue. Other vampires strangled or sliced their victims open. Most vampire accounts from history are true in their description of events, but unlikely accurate in their diagnosis. It is very probable that early Slavonic people exhumed bodies, only to find them with all of the above features: darkened skin, a swollen thorax, liquid blood, etc. But if we can say with almost certainty that vampirism wasn't the cause of these things, what did cause them? Well, bodies can do a lot of things when they decompose. These processes are complex and can shift widely based on a huge amount of variables. As we examine each of these to a degree, they all provide obvious answers for a would-be vampire. So let's begin with the darkened skin, the liquid blood, and the blood at the mouth. In death, the oxygen in the blood is all used up. This means the blood becomes darker, like on an exterior wound, a scab, or dried blood on a cut. This can cause the corpse itself to take on a darkened appearance. If a body is buried on its back, the lack of circulation will cause the remaining blood to seep into the lower parts of the anatomy, hence a lightened color in the face. In a process known as saponification, the epidermis can vanish and give way to a new skin to preserve the body. In this process, the new skin is often darkened to a shade of brown or even black. This is all to say there are a lot of reasons a body may appear dark in color, by today's standards, none of which are vampirism. Blood also changes due to bacterial action, which varies widely based on time and place of burial. Blood does coagulate after death, but it may reliquefy depending on how a person died. Sudden deaths, which were often said to cause vampirism, can cause the liquefaction of blood, things like concussion, suffocation, or other violent incidents. Vampires were often blamed for the outbreak of disease. Many life-threatening illnesses, including the plague, cause blood to seep from the body's orifices. This would certainly explain blood at the corners of the mouth. These early people believed corpses to be ingesting blood when in fact they were likely regurgitating it. Considering that the person who witnessed an individual die was not the same person who exhumed the body, we can further grasp this misunderstanding. As for the bloated appearance of early vampires, we have another straightforward answer. In decomposition, microorganisms produce gas throughout the tissues of the body. Without any sort of way to exit the body, the gases collect and cause the body to swell. Now what of the new skin and nails? Skin slippage can be another part of decomposition, wherein the epidermis deteriorates and reveals raw skin underneath. This can also happen to nails, hence we have the vampire's new skin. The white liver of the vampire, too, has a simple explanation. Cirrhosis of the liver is a condition brought on by excessive alcohol consumption. In cirrhosis, the veins of the liver become clogged, which can cause a lack of blood circulation in the organ. Without the appropriate amount of blood, the color of the liver can lighten noticeably. Early Slavic people were hard drinkers, so it's no great reach to think they had high rates of cirrhosis. The disease does not really turn the liver white, but more of a yellow shade. Perhaps the usage of white in vampiric accounts is just a linguistic idiosyncrasy, or the consequence of a few retellings and retranslations of folklore. Furthermore, the liver is the largest internal organ in the human body. When afflicted with cirrhosis, the liver swells and distends. So if early exhumers cut open a body, the liver may have been the cadaver's most noticeable organ. With all this in mind, it makes sense that white livers would appear so frequently in early vampire accounts. There is also some interesting psychology at play in the diagnosis of vampirism. In virtually all of the vampiric literature, when people exhume bodies looking for vampires, they find them. People found what they wanted to find. Damningly, exhumation records often proclaim that bodies haven't decomposed and unknowingly go on to describe symptoms of decomposition. Consider the above science and then the litany of reports which claim the body was fresh but it was bloated, or the body seemed untouched except it had new skin. This is really only a small selection of ways a body can decompose. Once placed in the earth, truly bizarre things can happen, things which the people of yesteryear had no way of understanding, so we should perhaps not hold this ignorance against those people. But ultimately, these strange decompositional events accurately explain early vampiric diagnoses. People of the time obviously didn't know any of this, so in the context of their day, these medical explanations were neither existent nor relevant. These features, the darkened skin, bloated body, etc., were the features of the vampire. So we now have an understanding of the vampire's folkloric appearance. But when these creatures rose from the dead, what did they do? What was the, for lack of a better term, lifestyle of a vampire? Modern vampire media tells us these undead can lead a great number of lifestyles. In some depictions, they are reclusive monsters who come out only to feed. Other medias portray them as hell-bent on world domination, keen to build an army of darkness. Meanwhile, still, we have seen vampires as distinguished and debonair intellectuals who feed some sorrowful void through life's cultural and material pleasures. The folkloric vampire of Slavonic and Greek cultures, though, had a very defined way of being. They were basically mindless, borderline catatonic entities who had little agency over their own actions. These vampires did not wreak havoc, spread disease, or attack humans out of malevolence. Rather, it was something of an instinct, far removed from any sort of intention. The vampire did not defend himself when attacked or exhumed. He rarely spoke in anything more than a groan. This is reasonable to expect. These alleged vampires being attacked and executed were, in fact, just dead bodies. Folklore and historical literature indicates that vampires spent the vast majority of their time in their graves. In some parts of the Slavic world, a vampire could only feast on Saturday. But across folklore, there's nothing to indicate that vampires were allergic to daylight. This is a modern invention. The creatures, of course, drank blood. The modern vampire leaves the hallmark of 2 small incisions on the neck of his victim. As mentioned, folkloric vampires typically bit their victims somewhere in the thorax. According to the Russians, the vampire bit at the chest near the heart. In Romania, they did the same. In Poland, vampires bit their victims on the left breast. In recent years, there has been an attempt to explain vampirism by way of a disease called porphyria. This disease disfigures victims, sometimes causing gums to recede, which can make the teeth look elongated. The disease can also cause a sensitivity to sunlight. To treat porphyria, medieval doctors suggested injecting or intaking heme, which is found in blood. The logic then follows, dubiously, that victims of the disease once spent their days consuming human blood. The problems with this theory are abundant. Most primarily, these symptoms do not describe folkloric vampires, but instead modern, fictionalized vampires. Additionally, here we are put on a slippery slope towards stigmatizing those who suffer from the condition. Porphyria is not a vampire disease, and it does not explain in any part early European vampirism. You see, blood was not the only thing that vampires consumed. They were said to mangle and eat livestock or even humans. An explanation for this is simple enough. Wild animals attack domestic animals, and occasionally they also attack people. Europeans of yesteryear never actually saw the undead walking around and attacking the living, so they prescribed the vampire as a shapeshifter, often able to transform into a wolf or dog. But notably, never a bat. Indeed, bats have no place in the early folklore of vampires. This is a modern invention based around the animal Desmodus rotundus, or the vampire bat. We know this is a modern notion because vampire bats do not live in Romania, Transylvania, or Eastern Europe. They are found only in Central and South America. Vampires were also said to consume the flesh of the dead. Early Slavic reports indicate corpses which have been mauled, mangled, or scavenged. This is easy to explain. Vampirism was usually suggested in times of disaster, but during these disasters, protecting and treating the living was the primary priority. So burials were undertaken hurriedly and often haphazardly. A corpse in a shallow, unprotected grave would certainly be an easy target for scavenging animals. There were many, many other abilities which vampires were said to possess. We can now turn to a piece of Galician folklore which I believe to be quite revealing. It reads, "The power of the vampire is very great and many-sided, even in his lifetime. He can kill people and even eat them alive, can bring into being or remove various sicknesses and epidemics, storms, rain, hail, and such. He casts spells on the cows and their milk, the crops and the husbandry generally. He knows all secrets and the future, etc. Besides this, he can make himself invisible or transform himself into various objects, especially into animal forms." Suddenly, the folkloric vampire has become all-powerful. He could cause sickness, he could change the weather and spoil livestock. He further knew all secrets and could tell the future or turn himself into an animal. The author here even included etc., which practically draws an infinity symbol over the vampire's abilities. While not all pieces of vampire literature proclaim so boldly, this is emblematic of the vampire's true function for early people. Catastrophes happen. Famines, disease, pestilence, natural disasters were all unpredictable and unknowable parts of life for earlier people. Vampires were essentially the catch-all, as witches would too become later in history. Indeed, we see vampires having abilities which almost suspiciously match their native lands. In Serbia, where travelers were common, vampires were known to turn over carriages. In Iceland, vampires stomped loudly on frozen roofs in the winter. Vampires did what people needed them to. This is the prize which eventually lies at the heart of our entire investigation, but we should not get ahead of ourselves, so we will return to this point later. For now, there is still much to learn about the vampires of folklore. The contemporary notion of creating a vampire is simple. One needs to be bitten by a vampire. Here we have an instance where the contemporary matches its folkloric counterpart. In the old world, vampires were said to bite humans. Those humans would then die, only to return as similar undead. But this was not the only way to create a vampire. Far from it, in fact. Much folklore indicates that certain people were destined to become vampires, through choices they made or even circumstances of their birth. In Greece, simply being a poorly behaved, troublesome individual was cause enough. In Bulgaria, we have an account that reads, "Haydukes, robbers, highwaymen, and arsonists who lead their asocial life in a nurturing wild and also die there, decompose unburied, or are eaten by wild animals." Alcoholism was another common way to become the undead. In Russia, villagers unearthed alcoholics as prime suspects in vampire outbreaks. Committing suicide was also a common path to vampirism, as was being a sorcerer or a witch in many cultures. Certain offspring were believed predestined to be vampires. Across various Slavic cultures, there were numerous ways to identify such a child. If a baby was born with teeth, the Poles believed them to be vampires. A split lip, an extra nipple, or a vestigial tail also marked future undead. Certain cultures also believed a body could become a vampire if an animal jumped or flew over it. In Romania, this was specifically a black hen, but the precise animal varies widely based on country. Another broader way to become a vampire was to die with a sort of unfulfilled life. This took a few forms, notably unfinished business or a premature death. In Greece, one text notes, "Dead people who had died alone and had no one there to take care of them. And when people die of a contagious disease and no one will go near them, and they bury them without a priest, without anything, they become virkolakes." Serbians believed that if somebody died without any witnesses, they became a vampire. Finns had a similar superstition, believing that a neglected corpse would return to torment the living. In Hungary, deceased soldiers were often turned into the undead due to the absence of proper funerals. Other Slavic people believed that a mother may return from the dead if no one adopted her child. Interestingly, these sudden deaths can often accompany a hurried and haphazard burial. War, disease, and crime usually resulted in the dead being rushed to their grave. It is precisely this sort of half-hearted burial which can cause many of the previously discussed decompositional issues. We now have a broad understanding of the folkloric vampire in appearance, activity, and even origin. So once these vampires began to roam the earth, what was to be done? What did it look like to fight or even hunt the vampire? The best way for early Europeans to destroy vampires was through prevention, and so most vampire deterrents took the form of funerary rites. One popular mode of thinking was that people must identify things which would compel the dead to rise and satisfy those needs preemptively. Some people believed that vampires were compelled by a need to chew. That was why they ate the flesh and blood of the living. So it was quite popular to bury people with items they could either chew on or which would prevent the action of chewing. In Prussia, people filled the mouths of the dead with broken pieces of ceramic. Other times they used dirt or an old book. Western Slavs often placed a brick under the chin or in the mouth of the corpse, so that the teeth would shatter if the body began to chew. In a more hospitable custom, many Europeans provided the corpse with food. Thereby, the body would not need to seek food by attacking humans or livestock. Some burial rites sought to solve other issues. Pomeranian Slavs provided their dead with a candle so the corpse could find its way to heaven rather than roaming the earth as a revenant. There were also more forceful traditions wherein bodies were buried with poppy seeds due to their supposed sedative effects. There's a modern superstition which claims if a vampire sees a knot, he will be compelled to untie it. This was true of early folkloric vampires as well. Many cultures buried the dead with nets and ropes which were tied in dozens of complex knots. If the dead did awaken, they would be forced to remain in their coffin, untying these objects for years. On occasion, bodies were exhumed, treated in any number of these ways, and then reburied. There exists the following Polish account. The wife of the peasant who had met the revenant told about it in the whole village, but people did not want to believe her. Only when a number of people had convinced themselves that the revenant was actually coming into this village did they tell the priest. He then had the revenant taken out of the grave, had a slip of paper put under his tongue with his name on it, had him laid face down, and struck with a shovel on the hind end. Since then, he never came into the village again. Across much of the Slavic countries, bodies were buried with sharp objects to prevent vampirism. The sickle was a popular option placed upon the stomach to prevent the swelling which marked the vampire. In Romania, there is an account that dictates a sickle must be inserted into the heart of the corpse. There are also reports of knives, pins, and wooden stakes being buried alongside a body. Early Romanians inserted sharpened sticks into the ground above the body so that if the corpse attempted to rise, it would be punctured and returned to death. But suppose all of these precautions were thwarted or just neglected entirely in the first place. It then falls to the living to ward off vampires. Here, folklore has been well preserved. It was broadly believed that vampires were repulsed by strong smells, and so garlic was a common deterrent. In a similar vein, so too was mustard, cow dung, and human feces, all of which were smeared around the person or home to repel vampires. As we saw in the Powell account, the blood of the supposed vampire itself was a common deterrent. This was often smeared on a person's clothing or body. In Pomerania, people made a mixture of this blood and brandy to drink, which would likewise protect the drinker against the vampire. As Paul Barber points out in his book Vampires, Burial, and Death, this custom produced a darkly comedic result. Vampires probably never drank the blood of humans, but indeed, humans drank the blood of vampires. The sign of the cross is another piece of folklore which has survived into our modern vampire landscape. In Serbia, a wooden cross over the doorframe kept vampires out of a house. Tar was also smeared in the sign of the cross on doors for the same effect. Making the cross with one's fingers near a graveyard could also keep away revenants. Perhaps more kindly, in Serbia, it was said that one could simply direct a vampire into a forest. There, the vampire could eat the animals of the forest and remain sated forever. Perhaps the implication was that the vampire could alternatively be killed by those animals. Either way, the issue was solved. But let's suppose none of these work, and the individual encounters a vampire. Thankfully, folklore has provided us with many, many ways to hunt the undead. The first step in hunting the folkloric vampire is, of course, finding that vampire. In cases of disease outbreaks, the easiest way to find the vampire was to determine who succumbed to the illness first. That body would be exhumed, dealt with, and the village would be free of their vampiric problem. In less clear-cut circumstances, a number of bodies may be exhumed, and the one who showed the least amount of decomposition would be deemed the vampire and then dealt with. We will soon discuss these methods of dealing with, but as far as finding the vampire, this was an easy solution. The process was not always so simple. Another way to find the vampire in many Eastern European cultures was to lead a horse through a graveyard. It was said that the horse would refuse to walk over the grave of the vampire. Albanian legend says the horse must be black, while others indicate a blonde or a white color. Failing this, a person could also investigate the burial plot itself to find the vampire. An early Serbian schoolbook reads, if the grave is sunk in, if the cross has taken a crooked position, and if there are other indications of this sort, they suggest that the deceased has transformed himself into a vampire. This was presumably owing to the vampire's regular excursions from its grave. The more, quote, real explanation for this would be that bodies buried quickly in shallow graves were more likely to show a patch of disturbed earth. Other texts indicate that the grave of a vampire would emit a blue glow or even a blue flame. Modern science does well to explain this belief. When bodies are buried, they do emit gases and attract various bacteria. These gases could cause a sort of glow around a grave if caught in the right moonlight. Likewise, there exist a number of bioluminescent bacteria which could give the impression of a light. As for a flame, specifically, the culprit may be linguistic. Perhaps we have generations of translation, retelling, and retranslation to blame. It was also said in many instances that vampires had the ability to turn invisible. This power mostly seemed to manifest, perhaps conveniently, when the vampire was out of his grave. See, there are no records of attempted exhumations wherein the exhuming party found an empty coffin. In each culture where invisibility was part of the vampire's repertoire, there were wildly different ways to solve this problem. In Yugoslavia, it was said that invisible vampires could be seen by twins born on Saturday, provided those twins were wearing their clothing inside out. Dogs were often able to see invisible vampires. It was said by Russians that a dog would snarl and bark in the presence of such a revenant. Back in Yugoslavia, though, this was precisely not the case. The text from that region reads, "There is no vampire in the village if the dogs are barking, but if they are quiet, then the vampire has come." So let's suppose you've identified the vampire. It's now time to kill the undead. Vampires were considered sorrowful creatures. They did not want to be vampires. They did not want to be still alive. So killing was often referred to as putting them at peace. It was not really an act of violence, but an act of mercy. Today, staking a vampire is the most famous way to kill the creature. Indeed, this is a piece of folklore that has survived through the ages. Staking was one of the most common ways for early people to kill their vampires. Folklore does provide us with more specific instructions than simple impaling, however. Generally, the type of wood used for staking was quite important. In many northern areas surrounding the Baltic, ash was the ideal wood. In Poland, oak. Serbian custom dictated hawthorn. It's not entirely clear where these rules came from. There are some linguistic options that have been explored, but to no significant conclusions. What is clear, though, is that staking killed a vampire simply because it killed a human. Serbian travelers claim that a sharp knife worked just as well as a wooden stake. Other accounts indicate swords or even nails are perfectly effective. Broadly, it seemed anything that would certainly kill a human could kill a vampire. This has included shovels, fire, and even decapitation. The Russians had a markedly unique way of dealing with their vampires. In their part of the world, the undead were often blamed for droughts. So perhaps to counteract this ability, the body of a supposed vampire was to be thrown into a body of water. We have a similar deathly relation to water in Albania. There, the soul was believed to seek water after death, but this water was also a danger to the soul. In Bulgaria, containers of water were covered or emptied after a death. It's not hard to see how these cultures and their beliefs could have cross-pollinated in regards to vampires. Today, there is a piece of lore which indicates vampires are required to rest in their native soil. Each day, the vampire must return to rest on Earth from his homeland. To kill the vampire may be as simple as disposing of or replacing this soil. This is another modern invention, another which seemed to begin with Bram Stoker's Dracula itself. The folkloric vampire generally did not travel. In the rare instances a vampire did roam to other countries, no mention was made of his native soil being relevant. Cremation was the preferred method of vampire killing in Greece. It has also been seen in most European countries which held vampiric folklore. However, outside of Greece, cremation was sort of a last resort. This was due in large part to simple logistics. An adult body can take 1 to 3 hours to cremate, which requires a constantly burning fire and large volumes of fuel. An oil-burning furnace, for example, can require up to 24 gallons for a single cremation. Additionally, the body will not simply ignite in flames. It will require an accelerant. In Greece, for example, people have used fabric soaked in animal fat. Now, suppose you did not have a modern furnace or large amounts of fuel. Likewise, consider that accelerants like animal fat may have been scarce. To replicate this furnace cremation over an open fire would have been prohibitively laborious and expensive. Indeed, there is at least one account of these troubles impacting the killing of a vampire. In this instance, burning the vampire required an enormous amount of wood, and the fire still would not destroy the body. The executioner cut the body into small pieces, which still proved difficult to burn. We should also keep in mind that vampiric outbreaks occurred in times of crisis. This would hardly be the circumstance for early people to literally burn their most precious resources. Broadly, staking and decapitation were the most common ways of dispatching suspected vampires. So at this point we have a very strong understanding of the folkloric vampire, especially with regards to how he differs from his more contemporary counterparts. But how did these blue-bodied, swollen, catatonic revenants become this or this? Bram Stoker's novel Dracula is without a doubt the most significant work of literature ever produced about vampires. It is so influential, in fact, that some authors have suggested the study of vampires can be divided into BD and AD periods. The book has no real protagonist, but follows a businessman named Jonathan Harker as he travels to Transylvania and visits a nobleman named Count Dracula. Harker discovers that Dracula is a vampire and flees the castle. The Count moves to England and brings a pestilence on a small seaside town before being killed by the vampire hunter Van Helsing and his comrades. The book has an interesting structure. It is not written in clear narrative form. Instead, the story is a scrapbook of letters, diary entries, and newspaper articles attributed to various fictional individuals and sources. Dracula is the culmination of centuries of vampire folklore and authorship. Accordingly, Stoker spent years researching for his book. It would perhaps be an understatement to call his research impressive. In fact, it could be argued that we know more about Stoker's research than about vampires themselves. Stoker spent his time on a wide variety of subjects, including geography, political history, folklore, natural history, medicine, language, and psychology. Consequentially, among these, Stoker found the Hungarian book Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. Indeed, large sections of Dracula seem to be plagiarized from this work in particular. It was also here that Stoker found the names Nosferatu, which refers to a vampire, and Dracula, which is Romanian for the son of Dracul. Today in Romanian, Dracul refers to the devil. In Stoker's time, it was likely a word for a dragon. It has often been said that the Romanian prince Vlad Tepes is the inspiration for the character of Dracula. It is true that Vlad Tepes was known as Vlad Dracula, being that he was the son of Vlad Dracul. Although Tepes' reign was marked by brutality, there is no evidence that he drank human blood. Stoker may have come across Vlad in his research, but there is no strong evidence from the author himself or otherwise that Tepes served as anything more than a namesake, if even that. Stoker's research was remarkable in labor and time spent, perhaps, but when we look at his sources, we find names like Andrew Cross, Charles Boner, and Nina Mazzucchelli. Without getting into specifics, we can broadly say there is a distinct lack of Romanian, Transylvanian, or even Eastern European authorship in Stoker's sources. And indeed, Stoker never traveled to any of these hotbeds of vampiric activity, not Romania, nor Greece, nor Turkey, or Transylvania. By the time Stoker wrote Dracula, these areas had cast a spell of intrigue over much of Western Europe, but not only for their reported vampiric activity. There was an increasing calamity in Western Europe over the prospect of trade and cultural exchange with these areas, these countries which were not exactly regarded amiably by well-to-do Europeans. There's not much to prove intention, but Dracula can be interpreted as an exaltation of English power. A foreign monster from the east invades Britain and spreads a pestilence, only to be vanquished by a group of warriors. Warriors who all have some amount of experience in colonial efforts and who are all English or English adjacent. To investigate this much further would plunge us into a world of interpretation and analysis of Dracula. So I will just say the above is one interpretation among thousands, none of which are objectively more or less correct than any other. More relevant to this video is the reception of Dracula upon publishing. It was a hit, debuting just at the height of Europe's vampire obsession and Eastern European disquiet. Critics heaped praise upon the novel, and it immediately inspired 2 stage plays, one of which was written by Stoker himself. But what truly catapulted Stoker's work into the archetype for our modern vampire was the medium of film. In 1922, the German filmmaker F.W. Murnau created Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, based on Stoker's novel. The film would go on to be regarded as groundbreaking in visual effects and storytelling, though it was certainly not a commercial success. Still, it propelled Hollywood to cast the Hungarian Bela Lugosi in Todd Browning's 1931 Dracula. Meanwhile, a Dracula stage play was touring through Europe and pouring fuel onto the fire of vampire obsession. Vampires did very well in the context of film at the time. The black and white color palette made for a dreary, spooky tone in which vampires excelled. Hollywood began to change the vampire, though. The blood at the corners of the mouth didn't read well in black and white, so they abandoned it. Instead of the vaguely grotesque form that folkloric vampires took, Hollywood injected the creatures with a tone of feminine sexuality. The industry propped up the actress Theda Bara as one of America's first outright sex symbols. Indeed, her nickname was the Vamp. In keeping with this new tantalizing sensibility, folk vampires were replaced by a carnal sort of thrill, still scary, sure, but wrapped in a veneer of intrigue and fiction. Over the following decades, the modern vampire continued to emerge out of Stoker's design. T.S. Eliot inserted vampires into his 1922 book The Wasteland. Cinema saw the golden age of horror, where vampires appeared in any film they could possibly fit. We see Vampirella making her debut in 1969. In 1972, Marvel published The Tomb of Dracula. These are just a few examples, but the result has been a creature who is quite distant from his European precursors. With each new incarnation, the modern vampire changes in shape, abilities, and origins. It has moved increasingly far from its original folkloric form, and perhaps that is the whole point. Many people would regard the vampire as being emblematic of the human relationship with death, that it is a creature conjured up to help solve our mortal woes. The vampire has indeed been this at times, but on the whole, I think this is far too shallow. The folkloric vampire is often said to be a shapeshifter. This is true in ways far, far beyond the reaches of legend. The idea, the fundamental concept of the vampire is too a shapeshifter, able to change with the needs of his time. While the vampire and his abilities have come a long way from the original folklore, the vampire as a tool for the human condition has remained the same. The vampire is whatever we need it to be. When early Europeans needed an answer to their catastrophes, so was the vampire. As Western Europe scrambled for puzzles to solve and science to apply, there was the vampire. When Bram Stoker and Europe had to reckon with unease over Eastern Europe, so too appeared the vampire. As Hollywood and American culture demanded thrilling, vaguely erotic subject matter, once again enter the vampire. Future vampires, of which there will be many, will not come bounding from the pages of Slavic folklore. Instead, they will be projections of our needs as a people, just as they have always been. The vampire is a house, built upon, destroyed, and then built upon infinitely again, constructed to suit the cultural or spiritual needs of its residents. The vampire may not be real as a physical entity, but certainly he is more than a fiction. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the beach and streaming anytime to create masterful that.
Yeah. Like shit. I remember back in the days, people called me a fucking vampire too. Okay, which video I wanted to watch? What?
Academic pursuits, the gathering of hard intelligence, these are generally seen as noble. They are said to enrich the soul and the mind. This is true, but not infinitely. It is possible to trespass so far down the spiral of knowledge that we actually make ourselves less intelligent. Ralph Waldo Emerson was an American essayist, naturalist, and philosopher born in 1803. On August 31st, 1837, Emerson gave a speech at Harvard College called The American Scholar. In this speech, he simultaneously eviscerated and empowered the students to whom he spoke. Today, this speech proves to have been prophetic. The internet age has made Emerson's words perhaps horrifying in their relevance. He predicted a trap that the pursuit of knowledge represents to humanity, but thankfully he also provided a solution. We will come back to Emerson shortly. Certainly he is the main character in this story. But in 2006, Daniel C. Dennett wrote about a fictional game he called Chmess. This game, Dennett said, existed in the context of philosophy. I would suggest that it exists across all academic pursuits. The game of Chmess is played by professional academics. In this game, a series of rules are mutually agreed upon. These rules may be Plato's theories on this or that, Nietzsche's ideas about some other thing. One individual enters the game of Chmess. This happens in the form of papers, studies, or dissertations which are written about the agreed-upon rules. Another player engages the first individual, publishing some other thing about how the first player's Chmess moves were either triumphant or embarrassing. The two players fancy themselves quite good at Chmess, and so they stick to it. The implications and applications of the rules are then debated, articulated, refined, and spun in circles. This goes on and on as more people enter the ongoing game, until we have a whole segment of individuals who have dedicated their lives to playing this game. But these people are doing just that. They are playing a game. They are not engaging with reality, with the reality that created the rules of Chmess. Instead, they are swirling around each other, hovering above the actual real world. The players are both parasites and producers, consuming the works of others and transmuting them into ostensibly new material. Everyone is citing everyone else. We no longer have any experts on how to do a thing, but instead experts on how to do responses to a thing, or how to do a thing about a thing, or what is the nature of how to do a thing. We stop asking how knowledge can be applied to life, but instead how it can be applied to other knowledge. The result is some bizarrely irrelevant, self-sustaining cesspool of highly applauded works. I have to ask, what use is all of this knowledge if its only context is within the self-contained circuit of other knowledge? Dennett argued that the game of Chmess basically represents the industry of academia, but in the internet era, the bulk of mankind's academia is now available to the layperson, in theory. So too is the game of Chmess. We sit around in front of our computers for hours consuming videos and papers, believing ourselves to be coming to conclusions on life. In reality, we are just coming to conclusions on conclusions. This type of knowledge is untested by any real-life application. I am no exception to this. In fact, I am as guilty of this practice as anyone, almost certainly more so. With each step down this spiral of academia, we tighten a set of blinders. We eat what we are fed, and we do not see what is not at the buffet. We close ourselves off to other sources of knowledge, those which have not been or cannot be recorded by so-called academic elites. Our desperate and well-intentioned search for intelligence results in us rejecting a huge segment of the world's wisdom. Our knowledge becomes an inside game, an inside joke even. It alienates us from the very material which it is said to concern. We know more, and somehow we know less. This is the trap which Emerson predicted in his speech. It is the one that he so eloquently eviscerated. Perhaps it may strike the listener as hypocritical to make a video which interprets Emerson's thoughts, but I believe by the end of this video that seeming paradox will be resolved. Long before Dennett, Emerson would have described the game of Chmess as living in a degenerate state. This was the phrase he used in American Scholar. It is a state of thinking without action. In the degenerate state, when the victim of society, he tends to become a mere thinker, or still worse, the parrot of other men's thinking. Emerson says that when we collectively exist in the degenerate state, our society puts a steel lid on itself. Under this lid, we find only flashy exertions of mechanical skill, academia for the sake of academia. This degenerate state cannot create progress, quite the opposite. To live in the degenerate state is to put a firm mark of completion upon man's experience in the world. A society in the degenerate state severs its pieces from its whole. The worker, the tradesman, are boxed into their roles. These people are not understood or even considered by anyone of true societal power. Their efforts are not really applauded, and their perspectives are not really considered. The individual, accordingly, resigns himself to this role. He becomes subject to his own toil, sectioned off from the rest of a society. The farmer becomes the hands, while the academic becomes the brains. But in reality, Emerson notes that a society is one body. We are all connected. The hands are worthless without the brain, and the brain, too, is worthless without the hands. Indeed, the antidote to this disconnection is connection. We must realize that we are all, on this earth, one being. Emerson notes that when our loved ones smile, we do too. When they weep, we weep. When others scream, we feel fear. So we are not petals and roots, but instead we are all just a plant. The roots are purposeless without a petal, and the petal dies without roots. Emerson notes the way to discover this oneness and to break down the walls of academia is to venture forth into the world, to exit the hallways of colleges and institutions. To find a more honest intelligence, we must act. We must put to work our hands and our senses beyond the safe confines of formal, scholarly pursuits. Emerson did not make his speech to rip apart the idea of intellectualism or scholarship, but instead to right a wrong, to inspire a mutation within the idea of being intelligent. He saw America as being on a precipice. It was time to unlock the handcuffs of previous generations and create within America a new mode of intelligence, a new identity of learning. The change Emerson championed he referred to as man thinking. This type of intelligence represented not a lazy exchange of theories, not a game of schmess, but a duty to cheer, praise, and guide one another by showing facts. Not the appearances painted by academia, but facts that were active and present in the living world. In this effort, man thinking would simply work without need for acclaim. Often, Emerson said, man thinking will play the role of the idiot. As he learns and discovers new things in the real world, he will be confronted by his own ignorance. It will be embarrassing, and it will result in admonishment rather than praise. The learned men of yesterday will look at him derisively as he stammers and stutters. Man thinking's language will take the form of questions rather than answers. He will stand off in society, but that is fine. Instead of fetishizing appearances and decorum, the role of the intelligent man is to look inward. He competes only for his own respect, which is the highest honor that man can achieve in this world. In doing so, he learns not what the world appears to be. He learns not what academics have proclaimed it to be. Instead, he gains an intimate understanding of the world as he experiences it, as it is. He feels the salt of the sea not by reading about it in a book, but by plunging himself into the ocean. Emerson also posits that by looking inward, we truly learn more about those around us. He reminds us that we are all connected. We are all fingers on the same hand. He points to great works of creative achievement. So often they resonate with us because they betray sentiments or truths we already know but have kept private for fear of estrangement. The man thinking can communicate and confess these conclusions, and this boldness leads him to greatness. Often, Emerson notes, the more private our thoughts, the more universal they truly are. In today's world, we have branded this phenomenon loosely as authenticity. So many creative works impact us because they are received as being authentic. Emerson's man thinking faces fear. He inspects its origin, not the academia which it has produced. Fear is born from ignorance, so in learning from the world, we become more brave. Emerson says that we are too often like an ostrich, plunging our heads into the ground. Sure, it is safer in the ground, but it is not a life well lived. We cannot smell the flowers. We cannot hear the birds singing. This is no sort of life. It is no sort of intelligence to know only the dirt around our face. The world as we see it is full of pretense. We are told so much about reality that it can be tempting to take all of this pretense as truth because of obligation to custom, our own timidness, or simple laziness. But Emerson tells us the world is his, who can see through its pretension. Our image of the world may be a lie, and when we see it as such, we have dealt the mortal blow already. Emerson says we should not find intelligence only through the written works of others, but instead we must go to the source. We must find raw material through our intellect alone, which is unique and brand new. We can mold this raw material into intelligence. We must meet people. Emerson notes that life provides the cobblestones and we are the masons. When we talk to people outside of our typical boundaries, we collect these stones. Through craft, be it writing, thinking, painting, or even passive reception, we can turn these stones into beautiful monuments. In one particularly striking passage, Emerson describes how actions become beautiful, how reality becomes knowledge. We dwell on our experiences for some time, often long before they carry any particular meaning. Our memories, when the time is right, detach themselves from the material world like a ripened fruit. These memories become beautiful, insightful in their own right. At this point, our experience becomes knowledge. Our actions begin as insects, but change in time into soaring butterflies that are so dynamic and so beautiful that the act of recording them can only diminish their impact. Academic study can only copy this metamorphosis, can provide facsimiles of our own ability. It can copy the work of reality at best. The words of another will always pale next to the actions of ourselves. As we seek truth in academia, we attempt to transplant an oak into a flower pot. We take pictures of the dove, wondering why we cannot hear its song. Reality is a resource which can never be matched by academia. Books, scholarly materials, these things are finite. We may regurgitate and republish work forever, but it is still finite. Emerson points to craftsmen who spend so much time carving their wares that one day they wake up to see that there are no pine trees left. We can also see when this happens. It is clear and it is painful. We can see these so-called debates, which serve no value besides some falsely academic form of entertainment. We can find dissertations on dissertations. Meanwhile, flowers bloom new each spring. Waves crash every day. The seasons come and go into eternity. Emerson tells us that we have always the resource of life. Scholars lose their hours as they work, and the rest of us gain hours as we live. This can happen on scales both large and small. The society runs weak on an empty tank of intelligence. The artist may lose inspiration to paint, having seen every piece of art that he can. But the man who lives will lose nothing at all. As we look at humanity from so far away, from offices and from classrooms and from computer screens, the populations of the world have become herds or masses. As Emerson notes, their value has congealed into some monolith in which each is nearly indistinguishable from one another. Perhaps this has some utility in broad public measures or policy making, but this tendency creates subjugation. Emerson points to the low who exalt the glory of their chief. They accept their status as part of a herd or as a footnote in the novel of some other individual. They allow their own wants and needs to perish in the interests of their leader. Emerson says these people sun themselves in the light of a great man, believing it to be their own element. People believe he lives for us, and we live in him. But this is a lie, and if we venture forward into the world, we can dissolve the herd. We can see not only the flock, but each lamb and all of its unique beauty. We become open to the voices of the individual, not of the institution. And indeed, this experience is our true nourishment. Emerson notes that the man has never lived that can feed us ever. The same can be said for institutions, for colleges, for books, for the spiral of academia. For a pool which seems so infinitely deep, the world of academia provides us with remarkably limited nourishment. It can only pretend to do for the individual what experience can truly fulfill. The halls of institution promise the proliferation of knowledge. I see this as an abundantly false promise. In truth, they have built a guarded fort around knowledge. The guards at the gate take the forms of money, status, and, bizarrely, intelligence. It's no secret that college in this country is prohibitively expensive. This is a betrayal of students, society, and knowledge itself. For this alone, these institutions should be ashamed of themselves. The deans and presidents of these places should know only embarrassment. In the mirror, they should see only greed. The systems of application and admission also ensure that colleges largely accept individuals of status rather than produce them. Without being born into a significant set of advantages, financial or otherwise, it is tremendously unlikely for an individual to achieve any higher education. Certainly there are exceptions to this, scholarships, grants, etc., awarded to the hardest working students, but these must be recognized as cruelty, not benevolence. These programs are clunky and even Kafkaesque. Why must students compete and toil to be treated with a modicum of decency? Why should the exploitation of youth be the default state for higher education? Do we applaud the father who beats only 5 of his 6 children? To be admitted into college, an individual generally must be able to thrive in formal academic settings. This highly focused and specific ability can be called academic capability. But institutions like colleges have taken this academic capability to be the same thing as intelligence. Certainly anyone who has gone into the world would realize how incorrect this is. A person doesn't need to have academic capability to offer wisdom, but institutions have locked this entire genre of thought out of their halls. So with their vast expanse of knowledge, academic institutions offer only one segment of the wisdom that the world has on offer. These places are full of the academically capable, not necessarily the intelligent. So what is this genre of intelligence that institutions find so uninteresting? It is tempting to consider this idea of going out into the world as traveling to faraway places and distant locales. That would be a mistake. Instead, as Emerson notes, we must sit at the feet of the familiar. We must learn the insight of the commonplace, of songs in the streets, of the breeze through the meadows, of things which are not found in the fortress of academic pursuit. Only then can we understand the world in which we live, rather than the picture of it we have chosen to accept. Simple things have meaning, as Emerson says. A drop is an ocean. The pleasing is the sublime. The decent is the beautiful. Perhaps one may be able to live their whole life studying academia and even making a decent salary for the work. Perhaps they can live happily in the world created by these academic pursuits. But when that individual lies on their deathbed, they must realize the world they have lived in is a fiction. It is missing pieces. It is a cabin that is missing a wall. And then, with death, it is, of course, far too late to build that wall. Certainly no reasonable person would declare that we should abolish all academic pursuits, that these things have no purpose. Indeed, Emerson notes that the human mind is nourished by knowledge. For a long time, history's greatest individuals had nothing but the printed page, and history produced a lot of great people. But Emerson points to the idea of creative reading. He says that just as there is creative writing, there too exists creative reading. In this pursuit, Emerson basically encourages a type of selective reading. Find things of value in books, meditate on them, and discard those which do not provide you value, and then move on. Furthermore, Emerson notes that there is a vast volume of information which can only be communicated through formal academia. He points to exact science as an example. Going out into the world would be a poor way to learn brain surgery. Watching wind in the trees will not teach you how Caesar conquered Gaul. Colleges, in this way, are indispensable institutions for teaching this information. But they should aim not only to teach, they must aim to create. Emerson says they can only highly serve us when they aim not to drill but to create. When they gather from far every ray of various genius to their hospitable halls, and by the concentrated fires set the hearts of their youth on flame. Emerson followed these words with a prophecy that today has proven to be resoundingly true. Forget this, and our American colleges will recede in their public importance, whilst they grow richer every year. Today, degrees have never been more useless. Colleges have never been more profitable. So academic pursuits, of course, have their utility, and that utility can exist in many ways, whether that is relaying technical information or potentially inspiring a new generation of thinkers. But we should avoid academia for academia's sake. As a writer, of course, Emerson held a great love for literature. Indeed, in this speech, he professes that books are the best of things. But he cautioned strongly that when books were abused, they became the worst of things. In a surprisingly casual turn of phrase, Emerson singles out the idea of the bookworm. He notes that this book-learned class turn literature into some type of third dominion, some force that is neither part of the world nor the human soul. In this way, the power of the written word becomes stripped from any context. What purpose does a book serve if not the world or the soul? Emerson notes that books must inspire, not transmute. If we allow books to destroy our individual thought and action, we are better to not have read anything. He says that the abuse of books turns men from systems into satellites. He cautions against letting a book deactivate your soul. The active soul is the one thing of worth that all humans are entitled to. The active soul is genius, which lies inside all of us in one way or another. The man who cannot write a song is perhaps a genius carpenter. The man who cannot build a bench is perhaps a genius musician. There were bound to be yet discovered versions of this brilliance. The book, the college, the school, the institution. Emerson believed these things stopped with the past utterance of genius. They established standards and stuck to those standards. But truly creative actions, manners, and words, true genius, are not indicative of any custom or authority. They do not prescribe to some established standard. They are produced uniquely and spontaneously in one's own mind. So institutions resting on insular standards and criteria were unlikely to produce or even recognize true genius. The mind, Emerson notes, cannot always see the way forward, and so we can use books to illuminate our path. But we should take this assistance with reflection, solitude, and thought, not blind acquiescence. Books should be for idle time. They must not interrupt or take the place of thought. There exist moments in life in which we can see the world so clearly. These moments, Emerson says, are far too precious to be wasted in other men's transcripts of their readings. Emerson was speaking about formal academia, but now in the 21st century we are all inundated with chances to learn. The issues he talked about now apply to everyone. I once thought the internet could be defined as the sum of all of man's knowledge, made easily accessible. If you want to know something, look online and the answer will be there. I now believe this to be false. In time, or today, the internet may contain every piece of hard knowledge man has ever produced. But it will still not contain a summer night's breeze or a butterfly landing on the finger. Glory and suffering and all of their insight, these things require experience. They require excursion. The world may not always be enjoyable, but it is always real, and for that, it is always sublime. Academia is important. Learning is critical, but we must not substitute learning for doing, or we will surely miss out on so much that our world has to offer. Today, with the world's information at our fingertips, making good on this ideal is profoundly difficult. But we must remember, there exists a vast expanse between what is difficult and what is impossible. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin was one of history's most famous Russians. He's known as a mystic, a prophet, a healer, but also a degenerate, a womanizer, and a manipulative con man. There is an otherworldly, almost satanic mythos about the man. The problem is, a lot of what we know about Rasputin isn't really true. Almost every biographical work on him is built on legends, myths, or outright lies. But recent reporting has breathed new life into the legend of Rasputin, making it easier to tell fact from fiction. As it turns out, some of the most famous Rasputin tales are lies, and some of the most incredible are absolutely true. Rasputin was a complicated, terrible, great, and mysterious man. So let's start at the beginning. The Rasputin family's roots lie in the far north of Siberia, a remote region in western Russia. At some point, for some reason, Rasputin's parents moved from northern Siberia to a village called Pokrovskoye. Located in a corner of western Siberia, Pokrovskoye is a tiny village on the river Tura. Indeed, if not being famous as the birthplace of Grigory Rasputin, Pokrovskaya would be entirely anonymous today. In the 1800s, Pokrovskaya would have been the quintessential Russian village, sparsely populated by peasants who mostly spent their time working in fields and going to church. Rasputin's parents fit perfectly into these scenes. His father, Yefim, was a peasant farmer and a church elder. Yefim also worked as a government courier, driving a cart between the nearby cities of Tobolsk and Tumen. In 1863, Yefim married Anna Parshukova. The couple bore 9 children, 7 of which died in childhood. Grigory was the first to survive. Perhaps being the first surviving child spoke to Rasputin's later seemingly unstoppable will as a force of nature. Perhaps Grigory just got lucky. Indeed, this conversation, luck versus something more, is one that will follow Rasputin throughout his whole life, but we'll get there later. Historians recently found Siberian records to indicate that Grigory Rasputin was born in January of 1869. But for many, many years, no one knew when he was even born. Really, the first 30-odd years of Rasputin's life are a black hole, shrouded in mystery. No photos exist of him as a child or even without a beard, and there's almost no information about his youth. Indeed, why would there be? Rasputin was born into the anonymous, impoverished life of the Russian peasant. In Siberia, he likely spent his youth as such, working in fields, going to church, eventually getting married early and having as many kids as he could produce. We can assume this, or some version of it, was the bulk of Rasputin's early life. He was uneducated and likely illiterate, as was typical for Siberian peasants at the time. It seems Rasputin was quite hot-tempered and unruly in his youth. As a teenager, he essentially cussed out his local mayor and spent 2 days in the village jail. This is really the only documented information we have about Rasputin's childhood. There are other tales of him stealing horses and committing petty crimes, but none of these have been verified by historical record. At some point, Rasputin began going on small religious pilgrimages to neighboring villages. In one of these journeys, he met a woman named Praskovia Dubrovina. She traveled with him back to Pokrovskoye, where they got married and had 3 children. We don't know much about his wife, but it seems most of her life was spent suffering, directly or indirectly, at the hands of Rasputin. Life with him was not easy. He drank excessively and was a serial womanizer. But Praskovia did stay dedicated to him and supported him till his death. After Rasputin's eventual death and the Russian Revolution, Praskovia and his son Ivan died in a gulag. It was basically a miserable ending to a miserable life. But let's get back to Rasputin, because at some point his life changed dramatically. No one knows what happened, and no one may ever know. But in his late 20s, Rasputin had a sudden, radical change in his life. He would later write that he had a vision of the Virgin Mary. This vision, or whatever happened, compelled Rasputin to go on a pilgrimage across Russia. It was also during this pilgrimage that Rasputin encountered more mystical, perhaps darker sides of Christianity. You see, in the countryside, Orthodox Christianity was still infused with the sort of undercurrents of paganism. Eventually, Rasputin met an elder named Makary in the town of Verkhoturia. Through Makary, Rasputin met all kinds of fringe and extremist Christian groups, including the Klists. The Klists were a sect of Christians who infused their teachings with the mystical and occult. Some scholars believe they engaged in group sinning. This was basically a frantic, frenzied sexual orgy. Their idea was that by sinning, one could repent, and by repenting, you became closer to God. There's nothing to indicate that Rasputin was ever part of the Klists. But these are the types of people he would have seen. And indeed, it seems these ideas were foundational in his approach to Christianity. Rasputin eventually returned to Pokrovskaya a changed man, inside and out. He became a vegetarian, claimed to have sworn off alcohol, and began praying more frequently and intensely than ever before. Whatever he was looking for, it seems like he found it, or some version of it anyways. Starting in 1897, Rasputin would regularly just pack his things and wander across the Russian Empire, seeking some sort of religious enlightenment. This type of journey, called a stranik, was actually very normal at the time in Russia. It was likely there were 1 million wanderers across the empire on their own journeys. These wanderers traveled in simple clothes, living like beggars as they went from church to church in seek of enlightenment. In his later autobiography, Rasputin discussed his journeys. I rarely got to eat on only potatoes. I did not have money and never saved. God would have to send someone to allow me to lodge. There I would eat. More than once I walked to Kiev from Tobolsk, not changing underwear for half a year. Not rarely I walked for 3 days straight, eating only a little. On hot days I imposed on myself the fast. I worked with day laborers. I worked and ran for rest to pray. When I herded horses, I prayed. It all sounds pretty miserable. On his stranik, Rasputin was humiliated by the higher classes of society. He was regularly beaten and robbed by thieves. This time served as Rasputin's school of life, if you will. During these years, he witnessed all parts of Russia and its population, from beggars and thieves in the countryside to aristocrats in Russia's largest cities. He gained a bit of literacy on his travels, but mostly Rasputin learned the scripture by memorization. As he learned and he preached, Rasputin realized he had a gift. Formally trained church officials preached in a way that was rigid and almost abstract, entirely removed from the everyday lives of the people. Rasputin, though, could infuse the scripture with a sort of unrefined peasant perspective that gave the writings a sense of relevance. He preached Russian orthodoxy in a way that was tremendously charismatic to lay people. This unique type of charisma set Rasputin apart from his peers in the church. Rasputin's appearance was also particularly striking. Even in photos, you can tell. He was taller than most and had deep, heavy-set eyes that were a green-gray color. Combined with his long beard, skinny frame, and black clothing, Rasputin realized that his presence held some power. This was something that he astutely honed in on and utilized for the rest of his life. By the early 1900s, Rasputin's preachings had earned him a small circle of followers. These were mostly distant family members and peasants who prayed with him in Pokrovskaya. Rasputin constructed a chapel in his father's root cellar and held secretive congregations there. These meetings fueled rumors, speculation, and even hostility from the village. It was said there were distinctly sexual elements to his church services, which is very likely true based on patterns later in Rasputin's life. And yet, all of this was little more than a beginning for Grigory Rasputin. Word of Rasputin's unique style of preaching quickly spread around Siberia. Put simply, he was a local celebrity. In the city of Kazan specifically, Rasputin earned a reputation as a great spiritual healer. In Kazan, local religious leaders were impressed by Rasputin and arranged for him to travel to St. Petersburg and meet high-ranking bishops in Russia's then capital city. This was in 1904, and Rasputin would have been about 35 years old. The peasant class in Russia, people like Rasputin, carried a version of Christianity that, again, was infused with shades of paganism and the occult. Russian elites in St. Petersburg believed these teachings were unsullied by metropolitan intellectualism and had merit as a more pure version of the faith. These elites in the church and government had a great interest in this alternative, mystical approach to Christianity. So Rasputin showed up at a pretty good time. In the capital, St. Petersburg, people just latched on to Rasputin really quickly. Indeed, Rasputin developed a small following in the aristocratic circles of St. Petersburg. Allegedly, Rasputin could heal physical aches and pains with the wave of his hand. His charismatic demeanor proved to be very calming. His audience was mostly women, and this was likely no mistake. Rasputin taught that through sinning, often sexual, you could gain God's forgiveness and get closer to the Lord. His followers saw Rasputin as something pretty close to a deity, both philosophically and sexually. At this point, Rasputin was only a few steps removed from the royal Romanov family. And one day he met two sisters, famously known as the Black Crows. Militsa and Anastasia were royalty from Montenegro who had married into the Romanov family. His two sisters introduced Rasputin to Tsar Nicholas and his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra Romanov. The Tsar and Tsarina were perfectly primed for Rasputin to wander into their life for a lot of reasons. And to understand at all why Rasputin would eventually hold so much power over the Romanovs, we do need to understand the royal couple. Because you see, Rasputin was not the Romanovs' first brush with the occult. Before meeting Rasputin, the Tsarina had an advisor named Nizier Philippe. Born in Lyon, France, Philippe was a self-proclaimed mystic and healer. He had been brought to Russia by members of the Romanov family, where he was introduced to the Tsar and Tsarina. Like most aristocrats, they were already quite fascinated with the occult, and so they were immediately taken by Philippe. He served as their advisor, often meeting with the royal family to discuss his visions, prophecies, and what have you. But most importantly, Philippe claimed to have powers that could help Alexandra give birth to a son. only a man could become the sole ruler of Russia. So as Tsarina, giving birth to a son, an heir to the throne, was basically the only thing expected of Alexandra. But up until she met Philippe, Alexandra had given birth to 4 daughters in a row. The aristocracy and Alexandra herself were very worried that she could not produce an heir. Alexandra authentically believed Philippe had mystical powers that could make her produce a male child. So he hung around for several years, gaining increasing influence over the royal family. But there's also an increasing distaste for Philippe because he was not Russian. People didn't want some foreign person exercising power over the Russian Empire. Eventually this kind of boiled over and the family had to send Philippe back to France. But before Philippe left, he offered one final prophecy. He told the Tsarina not to worry, that God would soon send another mystic in his place. Not long after, Rasputin showed up. So, understandably, perhaps the Tsar and Tsarina believed Rasputin to be sent by God himself. Meanwhile, Tsar Nicholas had just in that same year survived a sort of mini would-be revolution. There had been violence in the streets and mass strikes across the empire. Nicholas had been forced to make a lot of concessions to the people. He formed a parliament, instituted free public press, and expanded civil rights pretty significantly. Really, the entire Romanov family had almost been deposed. Nicholas was lucky to still be A, in power, and B, alive. When Rasputin arrived, the Tsar was perhaps at his weakest point during his entire rule. He was looking for guidance, for answers, for help. And the Tsarina had long since believed Nicholas to be, well, kind of weak. She didn't find him incredibly fit to rule the empire. So when Rasputin showed up, the Tsar and Tsarina both quite susceptible to his influence. For all of these reasons, the royal couple basically latched on to Rasputin. Immediately, they were swept up in his presence, and soon Rasputin would begin performing his now famous miracles. Around this time, Alexandra had given birth to her first son, Alexei. The child was born with hemophilia. This disorder was often called the royal disease. So many 20th century European royals had intermarried again and again that it was very common in the bloodline. Alexei inherited hemophilia from his mother. Hemophilia impairs the body's ability to make blood clots. So once you start bleeding, it's a lot harder to stop. This applies to injuries both external and internal. When Alexei fell or bumped himself, he began bleeding beneath the skin. He became swollen and distended. It was excruciatingly painful. The Tsar and Tsarina worried that this condition would eventually kill their son. It's often reported that Rasputin was brought into the palace because he could heal Alexei. This is not true. Rasputin was a spiritual advisor first and foremost. His healing ability had initially nothing to do with his involvement at the palace. But eventually, he became a healer for Alexei. No one really knows when this started, or when Rasputin even learned of Alexei's hemophilia. In fact, no one knows how many times or how often Rasputin healed Alexei. But there are a few definite accounts of this happening. In 1907, the Tsarina summoned Rasputin to pray over Alexei when the child was suffering from internal bleeding. Rasputin prayed, and the next day, Alexei recovered. In addition to healing her son, this incident also confirmed her biases. The Tsarina, like much of the aristocracy, had an almost fetishistic fascination with peasants like Rasputin. The incident would have proved this to be justified. The intelligentsia, the educated doctors, the elite religious men, they could do nothing to help Alexei. And then in comes this magical peasant, waves his hand, and the problem is solved. It's all very easy for Alexandra to believe, given her prejudices and beliefs in the occult. During the summer of 1912, Alexei had yet another hemorrhage. He was bleeding profusely, experiencing intense pain, and seemed pretty close to death. Alexandra even prepared an announcement for his death. The Tsarina telegrammed Rasputin, who was in Siberia at the time. She asked Rasputin to pray for Alexei. Rasputin wrote back quickly, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." Shortly thereafter, Alexei's bleeding stopped. Doctors at the time said the recovery was entirely inexplicable. From that day on, the Tsarina saw Rasputin as a miracle worker. He quickly became her most trusted advisor. And so begins Rasputin's mystical, almost supernatural hold on the royals. Rasputin was more than a healer or an advisor. The royals saw him as a connection to the real people of Russia, to the working peasant class that they, again, had a tendency to fetishize. But however close he got to the palace, Rasputin was still a debaucherous pleasure seeker. This type of behavior was much more acceptable within the peasant class. Rasputin knew he had to hide that lifestyle from the royals, but it was easy enough for a long time. For one thing, the royal family basically never left their palace. They were secluded from the entirety of Russian society. There's a story that once the daughter of the Tsar actually went to a shop and paid a salesman for some merchandise. When presented with her change, the daughter was confused. She couldn't understand why the salesman was giving her money. Outside of the palace walls, Rasputin spent his days taking actresses and prostitutes to bathhouses. He drank and partied excessively. As devoutly religious as he really was, Rasputin enjoyed the pleasures of life. Rasputin didn't always stay in the city either. He traveled a lot. He seemed to prefer the agrarian Siberian countryside to St. Petersburg's more metropolitan landscape. Certainly his drinking and sexual deviance were more acceptable by the Siberians than the aristocrats in St. Petersburg. There's a story about Rasputin on his travels, perhaps one of the most famous stories. It's often used to describe just how wild and out of control he'd become. The story goes something like this. Rasputin visited a hotel in Moscow where he drank and danced long into the night. Outrageously drunk, he jumped onto a table and exposed himself to the entire hotel. He's said to have yelled, "This is the altar at which the Tsarina worships." This infamous story is included in almost every biographic of Rasputin, but recent reporting has shown it to be completely false. The tale is usually attributed to reporting by secret police who were following Rasputin at the time, but when you comb through these police records as historian Douglas Smith did, there's just no mention of such an incident. These records show Rasputin went to the hotel, had a few glasses of wine, then left. But what Smith did find were letters. There's a police chief who hated Rasputin. Like many in the aristocracy, he saw Rasputin as a peasant who had just infiltrated their world. The chief took it upon himself to ruin Rasputin's credibility once and for all. In letters to his underlings, he specifically requested that they make up stories to paint Rasputin in a bad light. In these letters, the stories just get more and more outrageous. The police chief kept telling his people to make them worse and worse. At one point, Rasputin is at the center of a conspiracy to make millions selling the used underwear of military servicemen. The hotel incident is one of the many lies found in these letters. It just never happened. People also point to the memoirs from a British agent named Sir Bruce Lockhart. In these, Bruce claims he witnessed the entire thing, Rasputin getting drunk and exposing himself. But in Lockhart's personal diaries written while he stayed in Russia, there was no mention of any such incident. In fact, those diaries show he wasn't even in Moscow on the night he later said it happened. In truth, Lockhart just heard the story from someone and later added it to his own memoirs. When the police chief brought this made-up story to the Tsarina, she laughed it away. She could see that it was too ridiculous to be true. But from then on, whenever she heard actually true stories about Rasputin's conduct, of which there were plenty, she assumed they were just slander. Alexandra was so enraptured by Rasputin, specifically his ability to heal Alexei, that she refused to believe he would conduct himself in that way. There have long been rumors that Alexandra and Rasputin had some sort of romantic affair, but those are exactly that, rumors. There's no evidence to indicate that Rasputin was anything other than a close confidant, personal advisor, basically best friend. After the later Russian Revolution, government investigations came to the same conclusion. There was simply nothing to prove romance between the Tsarina and Rasputin. You could say that government wasn't trustworthy, but historians widely agree. They were just friends. There were likewise rumors about Rasputin having seduced the royal daughters. At one point, the daughter's tutor, Sofia Ivanova Ducheva, wanted Rasputin banned from the royal nursery. The Tsarina had her fired. Ducheva took her stories around the royal family, scandalizing high society as rumors began to swirl. Local newspapers printed cartoons of Rasputin seducing the Tsarina with her daughters nude in the background. There's been no evidence to indicate Rasputin ever slept with the Tsarina or her daughters. It almost definitely didn't happen. Regardless, this was when the tide began to turn on Rasputin. In 1914, Rasputin was approached by a woman named Zhenoya Guseva outside of his St. Petersburg apartment. Guseva stabbed him in the stomach with a long dagger, screaming into his face, "I've killed the Antichrist." Rasputin ran away, bleeding profusely as Zhenoya chased him down the street to attack him again. Eventually, he hit her in the face and got away. Stabbing, by all accounts, should have killed Rasputin. Even by today's standards, surviving a stab wound in the stomach is difficult. In 1914, it was almost impossible. Rasputin had a surgery and spent a long time in the hospital, during which doctors thought he'd probably die. Yet Rasputin miraculously recovered. Years prior, a priest named Sergei Trufanov had attempted to drive Rasputin out of the palace, only to fail and be exiled from St. Petersburg. Guseva was a follower of Trufanov. Although she claimed to act alone, Rasputin believed that the stabbing had been on Trufanov's orders. Guseva was declared not responsible due to insanity, and she was sentenced to an asylum. Although Rasputin survived, it was clear that the aristocracy was beginning to turn on him. You see, Rasputin had never been able to shake his peasant origins. Some St. Petersburg elites believed a peasant had no place in their society. Combined with the tales of his alcoholism and sexual deviance, they were clearly souring on Rasputin. Later in 1914, Russia declared war on Austria and Germany. In response, Rasputin wrote a prophecy in a letter to the Tsar. A terrible storm cloud lays over Russia. Disaster, grief, murky darkness, and no light. A whole ocean of tears. And so much blood. We will all drown in blood. The disaster is great. The misery is infinite. Rasputin went on to publicly double down on this vision, saying if Russia goes to war, it will be the end of the monarchy, of the Romanovs, and of all Russian institutions. But at the time, Nicholas ignored Rasputin's words. After some difficulties in the war, the Tsar took control of the Russian military himself, and so he played a smaller role in the government. The Tsarina took over much of Nicholas's governing duties, often with Rasputin remaining as her most trusted advisor. In letters to her husband, the Tsarina parroted Rasputin's views and opinions. She advocated for Rasputin's increasing role in the government, referring to him as our friend. However, Nicholas was not very receptive to Rasputin's opinions. Today, it seems that Rasputin had a very, very minor influence in the governing of Russia during the war. Meanwhile, the war was going disastrously for Russia. Millions of Russian soldiers had died. Rumors began to swirl around the aristocracy, rumors blaming the Tsarina and Rasputin for the failing war efforts. The aristocracy could not grapple with the failure being Russia's own fault. So they became convinced that German spies were all around them. The Tsarina herself was German-born, so rumors began flying that she and Rasputin were both German spies. Today, there's been no evidence of this. German records indicate that they never contacted Rasputin. Still, the aristocrats had to blame someone. They couldn't blame Tsar Nicholas. That would be akin to a political and social suicide. They certainly couldn't stand to blame themselves. But here was this poor monk from a peasant's background who had tales of scandal permanently surrounding him. Rasputin was a peasant who had weaseled into the uppermost echelons of society. His mere existence was a threat to the aristocracy. Altogether, Rasputin was an excellent scapegoat. Within 2 years, the Russian parliament was talking openly about their hatred for Rasputin. Monarchist and ultranationalist Vladimir Purishkevich began a campaign of attack. He gave a speech in parliament saying that Rasputin was a puppeteer for the Russian government. Purishkevich said that Russia would never win the war while Rasputin lived. And this speech did not fall on deaf ears. To a certain group of aristocrats, it appeared that killing Rasputin was the only way to turn the tide of the war. Among that group was a young man named Felix Yusupov. The Yusupovs were the richest family in Russia, even richer than the ruling Romanovs themselves, so he had a lot of sway. Felix Yusupov gathered a set of conspirators, including Tsar Nicholas's cousin Dmitry Pavlovich and Vladimir Purishkevich himself. Together, they set out to kill Grigory Rasputin. The story of Rasputin's death is something of legend. It usually goes something like this. Felix Yusupov telephoned Rasputin, inviting him to his home, the Moika Palace, for dinner. Flattered, Rasputin agreed, and the three conspirators awaited his arrival in the palace's study. When Rasputin arrived, Yusupov led him to the basement apartment. There, Yusupov offered Rasputin wine and cakes that had all been laced with cyanide. Rasputin drank, and he ate and ate. The cyanide had no effect on him whatsoever. Confused and worried, Yusupov pointed a revolver at Rasputin's chest. He shot Rasputin through the heart, and the peasant man collapsed on the ground. Yusupov and the conspirators left the palace and drove to Rasputin's apartment, intending to make it look like Rasputin had arrived home that night. They rearranged some stuff in the apartment and returned to the Moika Palace. Yusupov went down to the basement to make sure Rasputin was dead. Suddenly, Rasputin jumped violently onto all fours. Screaming and frenzied, Rasputin attacked Yusupov, who ran away up the stairs. Rasputin, crawling on all fours, made his way up the basement steps and out to the courtyard. Vladimir Purishkevich ran out to the courtyard and shot Rasputin twice. Rasputin collapsed in the snow. The conspirators wrapped Rasputin's body in cloth and dumped him in the Malaya Nevka River. 2 days later, police found Rasputin's body frozen in the river. There have been rumors that he was alive when tossed into the river, but there's nothing to actually confirm this. Water was not found in his lungs, as has often been reported. Rasputin, degenerate womanizer and drunkard though he may have been, was a little more than a scapegoat for the Russian aristocracy. So after they killed him, nothing really changed. Rasputin was a lot of things, but he wasn't the cause for all of Russia's problems. In fact, Rasputin's prophecies on the war proved to be eerily correct. That war did result in the downfall of Russia. In the Russian Revolution, Tsar Nicholas, the Tsarina, and their children were taken into a basement and shot. The monarchy was destroyed, and Russian institutions were eventually ripped apart. Had Tsar Nicholas listened to Rasputin, the entire world today could be wildly different. It's an interesting what if. Felix Yusupov lured an unarmed man into a basement to kill him in cold blood. It was an act of cowardice, plain and simple. Indeed, the only account we have of the assassination comes from Yusupov himself. And to be honest, it reads like a man trying to justify his own murderous ambitions. A series of events paints Rasputin out to be this devilish, Luciferian figure who is unkillable. Meanwhile, Yusupov plays the heroic archangel, determined to destroy evil no matter how hard he must try. Given the context, it's not just unreliable, it's borderline unbelievable. But we'll never know the truth. Today, lies about Rasputin's life have spread like wildfires. But thanks to one historian, we're starting to get some genuine answers. For a long time, Rasputin was a purely mysterious figure in history. Lies, speculation defined his life. But recently, the historian Douglas Smith published a 900-page book about the man. In researching for his book, Smith traveled all across Russia, from Rasputin's birthplace of Pokrovskaya to the site of his death in St. Petersburg. He combed through previously undiscovered police records, journals, and personal diaries to put together a realistic, factual picture of Rasputin. Smith's book has been the main source of information for this video. Above all things, Rasputin was complicated. He was a drunkard, Rasputin loved little more than he loved wine. He was a serial sexual predator. Virtually any woman who sat down next to him would be groped and grabbed. Rasputin was accused of rape on at least one occasion. Throughout his life, he cheated on his wife perhaps hundreds of times. You could say he was a deranged madman. Rasputin believed he could heal those around him with the touch of his hands and often took money in exchange for doing so. But Rasputin was enormously generous, endlessly so. He casually accepted these bribes only to turn around and give that bribe money to beggars and peasants. By the measure of his time, Rasputin was immensely tolerant. He accepted homosexuality in the church and was accepting of Muslims and Jews, saying everyone was a child of God, searching for the same truth. Rasputin was a dedicated pacifist, warning against armed conflict repeatedly throughout his life. He was humble, proud to be a peasant, and favored the rural countryside to his large St. Petersburg apartment. It is my opinion that Rasputin cared little for the material things in life, but was infatuated by sensation. Sexual deviance, drunkenness, and fame all glittered in his eyes. I do not believe he was a good person, but I believe he had perhaps admirable traits. Historical figures are not characters or cartoons. They're just people. They're messy and complicated. These are just guesses, though, and my assessment of Rasputin as a man should hold very little weight. Informed though my thoughts may be, Rasputin and the legend of Rasputin have been very intentionally constructed. On one side, you had the aristocratic conservatives who hated Rasputin. He was a peasant who had no sense of propriety and had sniveled his way into their world. They did not want nor need any other common people seeing his example and following suit. So, the aristocracy worked hard to spread any potentially damaging rumor or anecdote about Rasputin. But in response, the progressive commoners did the same. The more the aristocrats hated Rasputin, the more these people heroized him. The tales of his generosity and humbleness may be just as exaggerated as those of his deviance. Rasputin and his persona fit right into the cultural context of his time, for better or for worse. The Russian people were massively interested in figures like Rasputin, figures of the occult, of the mystical. There was a sense in Russia that the devil walked among men in a very real way. Famed artist Mikhail Vrubel painted demon after demon. The composer Alexander Scriabin believed that the devil was genuinely working through his music. These were big names and Rasputin fit in well. Still, one question remains. How was Rasputin able to heal Alexei? No one really knows. To this day it remains a mystery and likely always will. Primary sources on the subject are all contradictory. Some say he had no effect on the boy's health. Others say he could wave his hand and miraculously stop Alexei's bleeding. There are also theories, almost certainly untrue, that his healing was some part of a conspiracy. These theories posit that Rasputin was working with a woman named Anna Vyrubova, who was a close confidant of the queen. Allegedly, Rasputin and Vyrubova would give Alexei poison to induce bleeding. This would cause the Tsarina to panic and call upon Rasputin to heal her son. Vyrubova and Rasputin would stop administering the poison. Alexei would become healthy again, and it would appear that Rasputin's mystical powers were at play. There's no evidence to indicate this conspiracy theory is true at all. It is yet another legend. It's been speculated that the doctors were giving the boy aspirin, which we now know is a blood thinner. Rasputin often ordered the doctors to leave Alexei alone. By disallowing the use of aspirin, Rasputin may have inadvertently helped Alexei's blood clot faster. Again though, just speculation. Perhaps the best possible explanation, and it too is just speculation, is one of the mind-body connection. Today scientists are learning more about how one's mental state can genuinely affect their physical body. If Alexandra truly believed Rasputin could heal her son, Alexei would likely have felt that same sense of security. This could have resulted in basically a placebo effect. Even if we ignore every single half-truth and maybe lie about Rasputin, we are left with a truly incredible life story. Here we have an anonymous peasant who should have died in a ditch, but instead, he literally walked from a field right into the royal palace. He rose from the lowest dredges of society to sit next to the throne, purely on the merits of his own will. If there was a case for genuine prophecy, perhaps it could be made in Rasputin. Whether he was exceedingly intelligent or something more, it cannot be denied that his predictions about the fall of Russia and the death of the royal family were absolutely entirely correct. That alone is verifiable, and I think pretty remarkable. Rasputin was villainous and cunning. He could be good, but he was not a good man. He was powerful in ways history has rarely seen and that logic struggles to explain. There are a lot of lies about Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, but to make an incredible, perhaps horrifying tale of his life, all we need to do is tell the truth.
That's everything for today. Next live stream tomorrow.